The best preserved Viking ship in the world was not found on the seabed. She was found under a farmer's field, beneath a low green mound where cattle had grazed for 1,000 years, in a bed of blue clay so dense and so airless that the oak of her hull came out of the ground still smelling faintly of the forest. Her name now is the Gokstad ship, after the farm whose soil held her. And she was not lost at sea, and she was not wrecked, and she was not abandoned. She was buried deliberately and with great ceremony as the final bed of a king, somewhere around the closing years of the 9th century, in the land we now call Norway. A community of people hauled a full ocean-going longship out of the water, dragged her a distance inland across the flat coastal ground, dug a trench for her hull, laid a dead chieftain amidships in a chamber of timber, surrounded him with horses and hounds and boats and beds and all the equipment of a great household, and then raised a hill of turf and clay over the whole of it, sealing ship and king and grave goods alike into the dark. They meant it to last forever. In a way that they could never have foreseen, it did. For nearly 1,000 years, the mound stood quietly beside the fjord while the world that built it dissolved, the old gods giving way to the new, the longships giving way to cogs and caravels and steamships. The very memory of the buried king thinning into rumour, and then into nothing at all except a name the local people gave the hill, the King's Mound. And then, in the raw early months of 1880, 2 young men from the farm, restless in the idle season and stirred by old stories of treasure, pushed their spades into the top of the mound to see what was inside. What they touched, a little way down, was worked oak. What they had found, though they could not yet know it, was the most complete Viking ship that anyone would ever find. A vessel so whole, so graceful, and so superbly made that she would change forever how the world understood the people who built her. This is her story, told slowly, from the forests where her timbers grew to the museum hall where she rests tonight. The story of how she was built, who she carried, why she was buried, and how she came back into the light. It is a story about wood and water, about a king whose name we may never be certain of, and about the long patience of the earth. If stories like this one help you rest, the slow histories of great ships, told quietly through the night, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the channel so that more of them can find you. And now, settle in, let your breathing slow, and come back with me 11 centuries to a cold northern coast at the edge of the written world. The land that built the Gokstad ship was a land that lived by the sea because it had little choice. Norway in the 9th century was a long ribbon of habitable ground pressed between mountains and ocean, a country of fjords and islands and narrow coastal plains, where the interior rose quickly into forest and stone, and the farms clung to the water's edge. Travel by land was slow, difficult, and in winter often impossible. Travel by water was everything. The very name the Norse gave their homeland's spine of sea lanes, the North Way, the sheltered channel of sounds and island passages running up the coast, would in time become the name of the country itself. A family's boat was as essential as its barn. Children learned to row before they learned much else. The rhythms of the year were the rhythms of fishing, of coastal trading, of hauling hay and timber and livestock along the fjords, and, for the ambitious and the well-armed, of voyages that went further, south to the markets of Denmark and Frisia, west across the open sea to the islands of Britain, and eventually beyond, to places no one from these coasts had ever seen. In the region of Vestfold, on the western side of the great fjord that reaches down toward the sea from the site of modern Oslo, this maritime world was at its richest. Vestfold was gentle country by Norwegian standards, low, fertile, well-wooded, threaded with sheltered bays. It lay close to the sailing routes that funneled trade between the Baltic and the North Sea. and its chieftains grew wealthy on that position. Archaeology has revealed a landscape dense with power. Great burial mounds ranged along the ridges, a famous trading town at Kaupang, where merchants from many lands bought and sold, and, in the soil of its farms, not one but several buried ships, of which the Gokstad ship is the largest and the best preserved. The people who lived here were not the horned, helmeted savages of later imagination. They were farmers, traders, craftsmen, and seafarers of remarkable sophistication, bound together in a society of kindreds and assemblies, of law spoken aloud at the Thing, of halls where poetry was recited and lineage remembered. They were also, when occasion served, raiders, and it is worth pausing on that word, because the age we are entering is named for it. Toward the end of the 8th century, ships from Scandinavia had begun descending on the coasts of Britain and the continent, striking monasteries and trading towns, taking silver and captives, and vanishing back over the horizon before any response could gather. The attack on the island monastery of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England, sent a shudder through the Christian world, and is often taken as the opening of the Viking Age. What made these raids possible, what made the whole age possible, was not ferocity, which every era possesses in abundance, but a technology, a kind of ship that no one else in Europe could match. The Scandinavian longship of the 9th century was fast under sail, fast under oars, light enough to be hauled onto a beach or dragged overland between rivers, shallow enough to ascend waterways that ocean-going vessels elsewhere could never enter, and yet strong enough and seaworthy enough to cross open ocean in weather that would appall a modern yachtsman. It was the product of centuries of slow refinement, of a boat-building tradition passed from hand to hand along these coasts since long before anyone wrote anything down. And by the time the Gokstad ship was laid down, in the last decade or so of the 9th century, that tradition was at its absolute height. The dating is not a guess. When modern scientists examined the growth rings preserved in the ship's timbers, they were able to determine that the oaks from which she was built were felled around the year 890, give or take a little, and that she was buried perhaps a decade later, so we can place her precisely in her moment. The very years when, according to the sagas written down centuries afterward, a king called Harald Fairhair was fighting to bind the small kingdoms of Norway into one. The years when Norse settlers were carving farms out of the empty valleys of Iceland. The years when the great army of the Danes was contending with Alfred of Wessex for the mastery of England. It was an age of movement, of ambition, of long horizons. Somewhere on the shore of Vestfold, in the midst of all that motion, a chieftain of consequence decided that he required a new ship, a great ship, an ocean-going ship, a ship fit for a king. We do not know his name with certainty, though we will come, much later in this story, to the arguments about who he may have been. We do not know the name he gave the ship, for the Norse named their vessels Long Serpent, Crane, Bison, and hers is lost. We do not even know precisely where on the coast she was built, though it was surely close by, for great trees and skilled hands were both abundant in Vestfold. But the ship herself survives, and a ship, to those who know how to read one, is a document. Every plank of her records a decision. Every joint records a judgment. From her timbers alone, patient scholars have been able to reconstruct almost the entire process of her making. And it is to that process, to the forests and the axes and the slow rising of her hull, that we now turn. It began, as every ship of the age began, with trees. Not just any trees. The shipwright who undertook a vessel of this size went into the forest with a very particular eye, searching not for timber in general, but for specific shapes that already existed in the living wood. The Norse method of shipbuilding, so different from later European practice, did not saw its planks from a log in parallel slices. It split them, radially along the grain, driving wedges of wood and iron into the standing length of a felled oak, so that it burst apart into segments like a cake cut into narrow wedges. Each segment then hewn down with axes into a single long plank. A plank made this way is far stronger for its weight than a sawn one, because the grain of the wood runs unbroken from end to end. Nothing is cut across, nothing is weakened. But the method is hungry. A single great oak, split radially, might yield only a modest number of usable planks, and a ship the size of the one rising in this story consumed the hearts of many mature trees. Oaks that had been growing since before the age of the raids began, some of them perhaps standing already when the legions still held Britain. The keel demanded the most of all, the keel of the Gokstad ship, the long spine along the very bottom of the hull, from which everything else ascends, was hewn from one single oak trunk, straight and clean and free of major branches, for a length of well over 50 feet. Trees like that do not grow everywhere. They grow slowly in old high forest, where the closeness of other trees forces them to rise straight toward the light. And finding one was itself an act of expertise, of forest knowledge passed down like the boat-building knowledge it served. We can imagine, and here we are, imagining, though along lines the evidence firmly supports, the searching parties moving through the winter woods of Vestfold, the long appraising looks upward along a chosen trunk, the discussion, the decision. Winter was the felling season, when the sap was down and the wood at its best, and when snow made it possible to sledge great timbers out of the forest over frozen ground behind teams of horses or oxen. The axes rang in the cold air, the chosen oaks came down one by one, were limbed and cut to length, and began their slow journeys toward the water. There was no sawmill, no saw at all in the entire process. The Viking shipwright's toolkit was axes. Above all, broad axes, T-shaped hewing axes, small trimming axes, together with augers for boring, draw knives, moulding irons for decorative lines, and hammers for the riveting to come. With these simple instruments, and with skill that modern boat builders who have attempted reconstructions describe with open reverence, the builders could work green oak to a precision of fractions of an inch. The planks they hewed for the ship's sides were astonishingly thin, along much of the hull scarcely an inch thick, because the whole philosophy of this shipbuilding tradition was lightness. A lighter hull rode higher, drew less water, could be rowed faster, and beached more easily, and dragged, if need be, across a portage between two rivers. Everything unnecessary was hewn away. What remained was as close as wood has perhaps ever come, to the economy of a living creature's skeleton. Nothing present without purpose, nothing heavier than its purpose required. The building itself would have taken place at the water's edge, on a level foreshore near the high tide line, probably under the open sky, or at most beneath a temporary shelter. First, the keel was laid on blocks, its long, shallow curve, for it was not straight, but swept gently upward toward each end, established by eye and by inherited proportion. To its ends were scarfed the rising curves of the stem and sternpost, each hewn from naturally curved oak that had grown in the required shape, and each carved along its edges with the stepped lines into which the ends of the planking would be fitted. And then began the part of the process that most sharply distinguishes this tradition from almost every other in the history of shipbuilding. The shell was built first. In later European practice, a ship began as a skeleton. Keel, then frames, then ribs, over which planking was bent and fastened, the skeleton giving the hull its shape. The Norse built in the opposite order. From the keel upward, plank by plank, they raised the shell of the hull itself, each new strake of planking overlapping the one below it, like the clapboards of a house, and each fastened to its neighbour along the overlap with round-headed iron rivets driven through and clenched over small square iron plates on the inside. This is the method called clinker building or lapstrake, and the vessels it produces can be recognized at a glance by the stepped, shadowed lines of their overlapping planks. The shape of the hull was not imposed by a skeleton. It emerged, plank by plank, from the judgment of the master builder, who stood back and looked and directed the trimming of each plank's edge so that the whole grew toward the form he carried in his mind. There were no drawings. There were no written calculations, no plans, no models that we know of. The entire vast geometry of an ocean-going hull, its flare, its shear, the subtle fullness amidships, and the fining of its ends, lived in the eyes and hands of men who had learned it from other men, going back generations beyond counting. Only when the shell was complete, or nearly so, were the ribs added. Crossbeams and knees and floor timbers shaped to fit the hull that already existed, stiffening it from within. And here the builders of the Gokstad ship did something that still draws admiration from naval architects. They did not fasten the lower planking rigidly to the ribs. Instead, the planks had been hewn, not carved after the fact, but planned from the beginning, with small protruding cleats standing up from their inner faces, and through holes in these cleats, the planking was lashed to the ribs with cords of spruce root, flexible bindings that held everything together while still allowing the parts to move slightly against one another. The result was a hull that did not fight the sea. It flexed with it. In heavy weather, the whole fabric of the ship would work, twisting and easing as the waves passed under her, giving where a rigid hull would have pounded and strained. Centuries later, when a faithful replica of this very ship crossed the Atlantic, her captain would write, with something close to wonder about watching the gunwale flex visibly in the swells, while the hull stayed tight and dry, and would declare the bottom and keel of the old design a thing of genius. The men who lashed those spruce roots in the 9th century could not have expressed it in the language of engineering, but they knew exactly what they were doing, because their fathers and grandfathers had learned it on the open sea, sometimes at the cost of their lives. Strake by strake through the seasons of building, the hull rose. 16 rows of planking climbed each side from the keel to the gunwale. At the 14th row, the character of the wood changed. This strake, the Megenhufer, the strong plank, was thicker than the rest, a reinforcing band running the ship's whole length at the waterline of loading, the transition between the light lower hull and the topsides above. Above it ran the strake pierced for the oars, and above that, the uppermost plank carrying the rail. The seams between all of them were caulked with cords of animal hair, wool and cattle hair, spun loosely and dipped in pine tar, laid into each overlap as the planks were riveted, so that the finished hull was tight from the first day. And slowly, out of the smell of tar and oak chips and the endless ringing of hammers on rivet heads, there stood on the foreshore of that Vestfold Bay a shape that even the builders, who had seen many ships, must sometimes have paused to look at in the evening light. Low, immensely long, sweeping up at each end like a drawn bow, and ready, very nearly, for the water that would be her purpose and her element. Let us look at her now, slowly, from keel to masthead, as she would have appeared when the last shaving fell and the builders stood back. For thanks to the blue clay of her burial, we can describe her with a completeness possible for almost no other vessel of her millennium. She measured, from the tip of her stem to the tip of her sternpost, a little over 78 feet, call it 24 meters, or the length of 5 or 6 long-bodied wagons set end to end. Amidships, she was about 17 feet in the beam, and from the bottom of her keel to the gunwale. Amidships, she stood only about 6.5 feet, so that her proportions were extraordinarily long and low. A sliver of oak, a blade laid on the water. Fully laden with crew and stores, she drew perhaps 3 feet of water, little more than the depth of a man's knee to his hip, which meant she could stand in over a shelving beach until her forefoot touched, and her crew could leap into the shallows and haul her dry. Her lines, when scholars finally took them off in the modern era, proved to be of a refinement that startled everyone. Hollow entry forward, clean run aft, the fullness of her midships carried in a gentle curve that let the water part and close around her with the least possible disturbance. Naval architects who have tested her form report that she was, quite simply, an excellent design by any era's standard. Fast, dry, stable, and forgiving. She was built entirely of oak, except where lightness mattered more than strength. Her deck, if we may call it that, was of pine, loose boards laid over the crossbeams so that they could be lifted anywhere along her length to stow cargo below or to bail. There were no benches for the rowers, and this puzzled her first excavators until the likeliest answer emerged. Her oarsmen almost certainly sat on their own sea chests, the same chests that held their clothing and gear, each man's luggage doubling as his rowing seat, an economy of space entirely characteristic of everything else aboard. Along each side, 16 circular oar ports pierced the third strake from the top, 32 in all, each just large enough for the loom of an oar to pass through from inboard, and each fitted, a detail that speaks of hard experience in open water, with a small pivoting wooden shutter that could be closed from inside when the ship was under sail and heeling, so that the sea could not slop in through the holes. The oars themselves were found with her. Long sweeps of pine, graduated in length from about 17 to about 19 feet. The longer ones for the stations near bow and stern, where the freeboard was higher, so that every blade would strike the water at the same angle, and the stroke of 32 oars could fall as one. Whoever provisioned her thought of everything, and whoever designed her wasted nothing. Along the outside of the uppermost strake ran a thin batten forming a rack, and on this rack, when she was found, still hung the remains of shields. Round wooden shields, originally 2 for every oar port on each side, 64 in all, painted alternately yellow and black, overlapping one another like the scales of a serpent down her whole length. They were almost certainly not carried that way at sea, where waves would have torn them off. They would display the dress of a great ship arriving or lying in harbour, or, in her final service, of a ship going magnificently into the earth. Amidships, her single mast stood in an arrangement that shows the same intelligence as everything else aboard. Its foot was seated in a massive block of oak lying along the keel, long and shaped, its form so suggestive of a fish's body that the old Norse name for it was the curling's partner, and the fish. And above it, at deck level, the mast passed through an even larger timber, a great humped block of oak with a long slot opening aft. That slot was the key to the whole rig. It allowed the mast to be lowered backward, unstepped and raised again at sea by a small crew without heavy tackle, so that the ship could shift in minutes from a sailing vessel to a low rowing hull that could slip under bridges, hide her profile, or face a headwind on equal terms. The mast itself, of pine, is estimated to have stood somewhere around 40 feet tall. The surviving portion was cut off in the burial, so the exact height is one of the details scholars still debate. And it carried a single broad square sail on a yard, a sail of wool, spun and woven by the best modern estimates, from the fleeces of many dozens of sheep, and representing, in labour, an investment fully comparable to the hull itself. We know from later evidence and reconstruction that such sails were often strengthened with a lattice of leather strips or rope, and the sagas speak of great ships' sails striped in colours, though of the Gokstad sail itself only traces of white woolen cloth with sewn-on strips remained. With that single square of wool set and drawing, and her hull flexing easily through the seas, the ship could run, by the sober testimony of the men who later sailed her replica, at 10 knots and more, a speed that many working sailing vessels 1,000 years her junior would envy. She was steered not by a rudder on her sternpost, an invention that still lay in the future, but by a side rudder, a broad oar-shaped blade of oak hung on her starboard quarter, the steering board side, the very origin of the word starboard, pivoting on a cleverly engineered flexible mounting of plaited withe that passed through the blade, through a wooden boss, and through the hull, holding the rudder firmly against the ship's side, while letting it turn freely with the tiller that socketed into its head athwartships. Men who have handled reconstructions of this rudder report that it is light, sensitive and effective, and that a single steersman can hold the ship on course in conditions that would tire the helmsman of a heavier vessel. Every ancient depiction of these ships shows the steersman aft at his post, and it is not hard to picture him here, braced on the small raised deck at the stern, tiller in hand, watching the luff of the great sail, feeling through the withe and the oak the long conversation between the hull and the sea. And she carried her own attendants. Buried with her, and we shall come to the burial in its place, were 3 small boats, elegant clinker-built craft of the same tradition in miniature, the largest around 30 feet, the smallest a light rowing boat that 2 men could carry. These were her tenders, the ship's boats of a vessel that would often anchor off and send people ashore, and their workmanship is so fine that scholars have sometimes called them the most beautiful small boats ever found. Even her anchor survived in part. The wooden stock endured while the iron of it rusted to a shadow in the soil, enough to show it was of respectable size. Add the tent frames found aboard, their carved animal head finials still bearing traces of paint. Add the cooking gear, the great bronze cauldron and its iron tripod. Add the barrels for water, the baler of wood, the gangplank cut with cleats for footing. And there emerges the picture not of a bare hull, but of a complete, equipped, living machine for travel. A ship that could carry between 60 and 70 men on a serious voyage, feed them, shelter them under awnings at night in some quiet anchorage, and land them on any beach in the northern world. That was what stood on the foreshore in Vestfold when the builders finished. It remained only to get her into the water, and to ask what her master meant to do with her. The launching of a great ship in the Viking age has left almost no trace in the record, and so we must describe it carefully, holding to what the evidence allows. We know that the hulls were built close to the water, on ground chosen for its slope. We know from the ships themselves that they were light for their size. The bare hull of the Gokstad ship, for all her length, weighed only somewhere in the region of 7 or 8 tons, no more than a few carts of stone, and well within the power of her own crew and their neighbours to move over greased timbers laid on the foreshore. We know from later Scandinavian practice, and from the deep conservatism of maritime custom, that a launching was an occasion, a gathering, a feast, very possibly a sacrifice, for a ship in this world was never merely a tool. The sagas, written down long afterward but preserving older attitudes, speak of ships as if they were beings, with luck of their own, with names, with moods. Whatever words were spoken over this hull as she first took the water, whatever god was invoked, whatever beast was offered, whatever name she was given in front of the assembled district, none of it was written, and none of it survives. What survives is the certainty of the moment itself, the day the props were knocked away and the rollers took her weight, and 40 or 50 pairs of hands eased her down the shore until the water crept under her keel, and, for the first time, she floated. The hull that had been a growing thing of the land for 2 centuries as oak trees, and a made thing of the yard for seasons of labour, becoming at last what she was for, a creature of the water, alive to every ripple, swinging gently at her lines while the people on the beach watched her sit, exactly, perfectly, on the marks her builder had intended. Every boat builder in history has known that moment, and it does not change. Then came the fitting out. Mast stepped, rigging of walrus hide and lime. Mast rove through its blocks, the yard swayed up, the sail bent on, and then the trials, the first runs down the fjord with a picked crew, the builder surely aboard, feeling how she answered, how she came about, how she took the short, steep chop off the headlands. And then she entered her working life, and here the record goes almost silent. And we must be honest about that silence. We do not know a single voyage this ship made. No saga names her, no chronicle notes her arrival in any port. Everything we can say about her career must be read from her own timbers and from what we know of ships like her. And yet those two sources say a great deal. Her timbers, first. When she was excavated, the marks of use were on her. Her hull showed the wear of service. Repairs have been identified. She was not a ceremonial object built for a funeral, but a real ship that had lived a real working life at sea, most likely for a decade or more before she was buried. The wear on her oar ports shows the oars had turned in them many times. She had been somewhere, and often. Where could she go? Anywhere in the northern world. Her kind of ship, large, seaworthy, crewed by dozens, was the instrument of every activity that made the age. She could carry a chieftain and his retinue down the coast to the great assemblies, or to feasts and weddings and funerals that knit the scattered aristocracy together. She could carry tribute and trade goods to the market at Kaupang, a day or two's sail from her burial place, where Frisian cloth and Rhineland pottery and Arab silver changed hands within sight of the Vestfold hills. She could cross to Denmark, to the busy port of Hedeby at the base of the Jutland Peninsula. She could stand out into the open North Sea and make Britain in a few days' sailing, the crossing that her replica would one day make in reverse, or run north up the coast toward the fisheries and the fur trade and the tribute lands of the far north. And she could, of course, go raiding. It would be false to the age to pretend otherwise. A ship of 32 oars with a fighting crew aboard was a weapon, whatever else she was, and these were precisely the years when fleets from Norway were active around the British Isles, when Norse power was rooting itself in Ireland and the Scottish Isles, when the Seine and the Loire had learned the shapes of northern hulls. Whether this particular ship ever carried men to war, no one can say. She bore no scars that prove it, and her burial tells us about her end, not her career. The honest statement is this: she was built to be capable of everything her era asked of a great ship, and her worn timbers tell us she was used. And the rest is a silence into which we should not shout invented adventures. But we can, with a clear conscience, describe what any long voyage aboard her was like, because on this the evidence is rich. The ship herself, the equipment buried with her, the experience of the modern crews who have sailed her replicas. Life aboard was life in the open. She was undecked in any sheltering sense. There was no below, no cabin, no dry place at all when the spray was flying. Her people lived on the loose pine boards over the bilge, among their sea chests, under the sky. On passage under sail, with the wind fair, most of the crew had nothing to do but rest, mend gear, fish, sleep as they could in leather sleeping bags. Later sources tell of 2 men sharing one for warmth, and eat cold food, dried fish, butter, hard bread, sour milk, water or ale from the barrels, lashed amidships, for no fire could be lit aboard. When the wind failed or turned foul, the mast could come down and the oars went out. And then she became a different creature. 32 blades rising and falling, the long hull sliding forward at a steady walking pace, hour after hour. The oarsmen, who were not slaves, as in the galleys of the south, but free men, warriors, farmers' sons, each with his chest and his gear and his share in the voyage. settling into the ancient rhythm that eats miles, the way patience eats time. At evening, if the coast served, she did what ships of her kind always preferred: stood into some bay, touched her bow to the sand, and let her people sleep ashore, the awnings rigged, the cauldrons slung over a driftwood fire, the tent frames with their carved and painted animal heads raised against the dew. Those same frames that would one day be found folded in her burial, still bearing their colours. Navigation was by knowledge, the profile of every headland, the sound of surf on known skerries, the colour of the water over shoals, the flight lines of birds at evening, the sun and the stars when the sky was kind. Nothing was written, everything was remembered, and men carried in their heads the sailing directions for 1,000 miles of coast, as their descendants would carry the words of the law. This was the ship's world, and for some years, we cannot say how many, though the best estimates run to a decade or a little more. She moved through it, wearing the smooth places into her oar ports, taking her repairs, earning whatever name and reputation she carried. And then, somewhere around the turn of the 9th century into the 10th, the man she served died. And everything that had made her a ship of the sea was about to make her something else entirely. Before we follow her to the grave, though, it is worth lifting our eyes for a while from this one hull to the tradition that produced her, because the Gokstad ship did not appear from nowhere. She stands near the summit of the longest continuous story in the history of northern shipbuilding, and to feel her properly, we should walk a little way along that story. It begins, so far as archaeology can trace it, with boats that had no sails at all. From the bogs of Denmark has come a vessel called the fjord springboat, built more than 1,000 years before Gokstad, a great open war canoe of thin, lime-wood planks sewn together with cord, paddled by 20 men, already showing in its overlapping planks and its double-curved profile, the distant ancestry of everything to come. Centuries later, from another Danish bog at Nydam, comes a true rowing ship of oak, long and open, built in the 4th century of the Common Era, with iron-riveted, overlapping strakes. Clinker construction fully arrived, but still without a mast, still bound to the coasts, a ship of the age when the ancestors of the English were crossing the narrow seas to Britain in just such hulls. Why the peoples of the north were so late to adopt the sail is one of the genuine puzzles of the story. The Romans on the Rhine had sails within sight of Germanic shores for centuries, and yet the evidence suggests that Scandinavian shipwrights did not marry the mast to their light clinker hulls until perhaps the 7th or 8th century. When they finally did, the results changed the world. The marriage was not simple. A mast concentrates enormous strain at a single point of a hull that had evolved to flex. The whole structure had to be rethought. The keel deepened into a true backbone that could take the thrust and resist the sideways slide of a hull under sail. The midship timbers massively reinforced, and yet all of it kept light enough to row and beach. The earliest full solution we can touch survives in the Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship's near neighbour and elder cousin, buried scarcely a dozen miles away and a couple of generations earlier. Oseberg, found with the richest ship burial ever excavated, the grave of 2 women surrounded by carved sledges and wagons and treasures, is a vessel of breathtaking beauty, her stem coiling up into a carved serpent's head, her rail edged with ornament. But she is also, in the judgment of many scholars, a slightly earlier and less perfected answer to the problem of the sail. Lower in the side, wetter in a sea, her mast arrangement lighter, a ship perhaps happier in sheltered waters than on the open ocean. Though on this too, there has been long and lively debate. Set the 2 hulls side by side, as one can in the museum that held them both, and the Gokstad ship reads like the 2nd edition of a great book, revised by experience. Higher freeboard, deeper keel, heavier mast partner with a wide slot for easy lowering, oar ports fitted with shutters against the sea, everything a shade more robust, more weatherly, more ready for anything. She's what the tradition looked like when it had finished learning the lessons that ships like Oseberg had begun to teach. And she was not the end of the line, only a high plateau along it. In the generations after her burial, the tradition would divide like a river splitting around an island. One branch would pursue war, longer and longer fighting ships, their proportions stretched, their oar counts climbing, until the sagas of the kings speak of vessels of 30 and 35 rowing benches. The famous Long Serpent of King Olaf Tryggvason at the end of the 10th century, remembered in saga tradition as the greatest of them all, though everything about her comes to us through literature rather than archaeology, and her true dimensions are a matter of faith as much as scholarship. Archaeology has, however, delivered its own witnesses to this arms race. From the harbour mud of Roskilde in Denmark have come the remains of true late longships, one of them roughly 100 feet long, hulls of almost unbelievable slenderness, 30 times longer than the height of their sides, pure instruments of speed and troop carrying built in the 11th century. And one of them, tellingly, built of oak felled near Dublin, for by then the tradition had colonies. The other branch of the river pursued burden. The Nar, the deep-bodied ocean trader, shorter and rounder and deeper than the longship, sailed by a handful of hands, capable of carrying tons of cargo, or a farmstead's worth of people and animals and timber across the worst ocean in the northern hemisphere. It was ships of this humbler line, not the glamorous longships, that made the age's most astonishing achievements. The settlement of the Faroes and Iceland in the 9th century, of Greenland at the end of the 10th, and, around the year 1000, the landfalls on the coasts of North America, remembered in the sagas as Vinland, and confirmed in our own era by the excavated Norse site at the northern tip of Newfoundland. 5 centuries before any other European hull crossed the Atlantic, ships built exactly in the Gokstad manner, clinker planks, lashed and riveted, single square sail, side rudder, had linked the old world to the new, however briefly, however thinly. That is the family the Gokstad ship belongs to, and it is worth pausing on how strange and specialized her family was. Elsewhere in the 9th century world, other traditions built bigger things. The Mediterranean remembered, and in Byzantium partially preserved, the shipbuilding of antiquity, which had once produced monsters. The great grain ships of Rome, the colossal pleasure barges that the Emperor Caligula floated on a lake south of Rome. Vessels far larger in sheer bulk than anything the North would build for many centuries. In the China of the Tang and Song dynasties, ocean-going junks with iron-fastened hulls and watertight bulkheads were carrying cargoes the North could not have imagined, ancestors of the enormous treasure ships that would sail under Zheng Hu long after. Against such vessels, the Gokstad ship is small, but size was never her tradition's ambition. Her ambition was reach, the ability to go anywhere water-led, from the open Atlantic to a river shallow enough to wade, and to arrive fast, and to leave faster. In that single dimension, nothing else afloat in her century came close, and the proof of it was written across the map of Europe in the age's own blood and silver. Norse fleets on the Seine and at the gates of Paris, Norse kingdoms in England and Ireland, Norse merchants on the Volga, trading furs for the silver coins of Baghdad, Norse mercenaries standing guard over the emperor in Constantinople, having come there by river and portage across the whole width of what is now Russia and Ukraine. Every mile of it travelled in hulls that were sisters and cousins of the ship, lying quietly in our story, waiting on the Vestfold shore. The men who built her could not see that map whole, as we can, but they knew what their ships could do, and they honoured the knowledge in the way that mattered most to them. When a great man died, they did not give him a tomb of stone, as the pharaohs had, or a temple, as the Greeks might. They gave him a ship. And so we come, at last, to the death. Somewhere around the year 900, the tree rings of the burial chamber's timbers say the first years of the 10th century, and we can hardly hope to come closer. A man of the highest rank died in Vestfold. Everything about what followed tells us he was no ordinary chieftain. And the first thing we can say about him, before we come to the mystery of his name, is what his own bones say, because they survive, and they have been studied with all the instruments of modern science, and they tell a story of their own. A story, it must be said at once, with a hard ending. He was a man in his prime or just past it. The analyses have placed his age at death somewhere around 40, and by the standards of his time, he was physically extraordinary. He stood, by the best estimates, close to 6 feet. Some assessments say a little over, at a time when the average man of his world stood substantially shorter, and his bones are those of a person of unusual robustness, heavily muscled, powerfully built. There are indications in the skeletal remains that have led some researchers to suggest an underlying condition that may have amplified his growth and the heaviness of his features. Though this remains an area of interpretation rather than certainty, and we should hold it loosely. What is not loose, what is grimly definite, is how he died. When his surviving bones were re-examined early in our own century, the leg bones showed the marks of edged weapons, a cut to one shin bone delivered by a blade, damage to the other leg consistent with weapon blows, wounds that show no trace of healing, which in the language of bones means they were received at or around the moment of death. One does not receive such wounds falling off a horse. The man in the Gokstad ship died fighting, or was cut down, struck low in the legs, as a man is struck when he stands in a line behind a shield, and his enemy's blade comes in beneath it, or when he is brought down so that others may finish the work. Who he was fighting, where, and why, the bones cannot say. They say only that his last hour was violent, and that his people afterward did not hide the fact so much as answer it, with the grandest funeral their world knew how to give. Consider what that funeral required, because the effort itself is a document. First, the ship. His ship, we must assume, the great vessel of his household, was taken out of the water for the last time. She was stripped of some of her gear, her mast was cut down to a stump above the partner, and she was hauled inland. Not far in the geography of the thing, the burial site lies close to what was then the shore, on the flat clay plain beside a small river, and the sea has since withdrawn from it as the land of Scandinavia continues its slow rise. But far enough that dozens of men, with rollers and ropes and levers and days of labor, were needed to move 7 or 8 tons of oak across the fields to the chosen place. There a trench had been dug into the ground, down into the blue-grey marine clay that underlies the plain, and into this trench the ship was lowered and settled, upright on an even keel, as if moored in the earth. Whether anyone present understood what that clay would do, that it would seal her from the air and hold her almost incorruptible for 1,000 years, we cannot know. It seems unlikely. Other ships were buried in other soils and rotted to shadows. The choice of this ground was luck, or it was the accumulated grave lore of people who had buried things in clay before and noticed what clay does. Either way, it was the single most consequential decision in this entire story. Then, aft of the mast, on the deck of the grounded ship, they built him a house. A burial chamber of heavy timber was raised across the hull. Log-built walls, a steep roof of planks laid like the roof of a tent, and covered, the excavators found, with layer upon layer of birch bark, the North's ancient waterproofing, as if even in the grave the dead man's roof must not leak. The chamber's timbers were felled, the tree ring dating tells us, right at the turn of the century, and it is these timbers, more than anything else, that date the whole burial. Inside, along the chamber's side, a bed was made, a real bed, a fine piece of joinery with carved posts, one of several beds found aboard. And dressed, the surviving fragments suggest, with textiles of quality, and on it the dead man was laid in his clothes. Around him his people then arranged the equipment of his station, and here we must speak both of what was found and of what was not, because the grave, as we shall see, did not come down to us untouched. What was found is astonishing enough. 3 boats, the beautiful small tenders we have already met, drawn up and placed with the ship. 6 beds in all, and the frames of several tents with their carved animal head posts, painted in black and yellow. A sledge for the winter travel of a northern lord, the great bronze cauldron, big enough to cook for a crew, with its iron chain and tripod, wooden plates and cups and troughs, barrels, the fittings of a portable feast. A gaming board, its surface marked out for play on both sides, with pieces of horn, because eternity is long and a king should not be bored. Fish hooks, harness fittings gilded and fine, fragments of silk woven with gold thread, come to Vestfold across the whole breadth of the world from workshops far to the south and east, a whisper of the trade routes that ran from these fjords to Byzantium and beyond. A peacock, the actual remains of a peacock, a bird of India and Persia, which had somehow come alive up the long rivers or around the long coasts to die in Norway and be buried with a king, and which stands in the grave as perhaps the single most eloquent object in it. Proof, in feathers and bone, of how wide this supposedly remote world's connections truly ran. And then, around the ship, the animals of his household in death. 12 horses, 8 dogs, 2 goshawks, the hunting birds of aristocracy, killed and laid at their stations outside the hull. The horses and hounds of a lord who would ride and hunt in whatever country the dead inhabit. It is a hard thing to contemplate, that ring of slaughtered animals, and the narration of it belongs in a lowered voice, but it belonged to the logic of the rite, which was not cruelty for its own sake, but provision, the same logic as the cauldron and the beds. By the customs of that age, a great man travelled with his household, and he was being sent travelling. What the grave should also have held, by every parallel we know, was treasure. Weapons above all, the sword, the spears, the fine axe, the mail if he had it, and the gold and silver of his rank, arm rings, brooches, coin. None of it was there, not one weapon, not one ornament of precious metal on the body or in the chamber, and the reason was written plainly into the mound itself, for the excavators found, cut down through the layers of the hill straight into the burial chamber, the unmistakable shaft of a break-in. The grave had been robbed long ago by people who knew exactly where to dig and exactly what they were digging for. We will meet those robbers again later in the story, and they may not have been quite the simple thieves they first appear. But on the day of the funeral, all that lay in the future. On that day, the chamber was sealed. The ship stood dressed with her yellow and black shields along the rail, and then the earth began to move. Basket load upon basket load, turf and clay heaped over hull and chamber, and beasts alike. Day after day of labour, by an entire district, until a mound stood on the plain, originally by the estimates, well over 140 feet across, and perhaps 16 feet high or more. A low dark hill where no hill had been, visible from the water, visible from the farms, visible from everywhere in that flat land. It was not a hiding place, it was the opposite of a hiding place. It was an announcement made in the most permanent material available that here lay power. And the people who raised it walked home afterward into a world that had one great man fewer, leaving the ship to begin the longest voyage of her existence. 1,000 years of absolute stillness, 6 feet under the grass. And now we must ask the question that has hung over this story from its first sentence. The question every visitor to the ship eventually asks, standing before the hull in the museum's white vault. Who was he? It is one of the most tantalizing puzzles in Scandinavian archaeology, because we come so close, agonizingly close, to a name, and the record will not quite let us have it. The case begins with the sagas. Centuries after the burial in Iceland, the historian Snorri Sturluson set down the traditions of the old Norwegian royal house, the Ynglings, who traced themselves back through Vestfold kings to the gods themselves. In that genealogy appears a king called Olaf Gudrodsson, remembered by the byname Geirstadr Alf, the elf of Gokstad, a king of Vestfold, described in the tradition as a big and handsome man, greater and stronger than others, who ruled in exactly the district where the mound stands, and who, the saga says, died of a sickness in his leg and was buried in a mound at Gokstad. A place called Gokstad, the very farm, Gokstad, whose name the ship now bears, lies where Gokstad ought to be, and the local name for the mound, remembered long before anyone dug into it, was the King's Mound. Set the pieces side by side. A Vestfold king of unusual size, dead through his leg, mounded at Gokstad. And in the mound at Gokstad, a man of unusual size, his legs marked by the wounds that killed him. For a long time, the identification seemed almost irresistible, and in older books, it is often stated nearly as fact. The Gokstad chieftain was Olaf Geirstadr Alf, uncle in the traditional genealogy of Harald Fairhair himself. But hold the pieces up to the light and they begin to slide apart. The saga says a sickness in the leg, the bones say blades. One might reconcile them. A wound that festered could become, in a century of retelling, a sickness. But it is a reconciliation, not evidence. Graver still is the arithmetic of time. The traditional chronology places Olaf's death well before the tree ring dates allow the Gokstad burial to have happened. If the chamber timbers were felled at the century's turn, the man they sheltered died a generation after the Olaf of the saga, chronology ought to have died. Scholars have pushed and pulled at both ends. Saga chronology is famously soft, and tree ring dates famously hard. And some have proposed other candidates from the shadowy king lists of the age, and others have concluded, soberly, that the honest answer is that we do not know and probably never will. The sagas were written 3 centuries after the event by men working from oral tradition. The 9th century Vestfold they describe is a landscape remembered through fog. What we can say with confidence is not a name, but a position. The man in the ship belonged to the summit of his society, in a district that the largest political story of the age, the unification of Norway, was even then swallowing. It is entirely possible that he died in that story, in the wars and killings by which Harald Fairhair and his rivals reordered the north. The wounds in his legs would fit such an end as well as they fit any other. It is possible he was the last independent great man of his line, buried with defiant magnificence by a household that could feel the world changing. It is possible he was something else entirely. The mound keeps that secret still, and there is a kind of rightness in it. The ship survived, the splendor survived, the body survived, and the name, the lightest thing of all, a breath, a word, is what the 1,000 years took. There is, however, a strange coda to the question of his identity, and it concerns those grave robbers. When archaeologists in recent decades re-examined the break-in shaft and compared it with a remarkably similar break-in at the Oseberg mound nearby, a pattern emerged that has changed how many scholars think about both crimes. The robbers had not behaved like thieves. Thieves work fast, take what glitters, and disturb as little as possible. These diggers had cut a broad, laborious, almost official trench. They had entered the chamber, and they had taken not only the portable wealth, but, it appears, they had deliberately disturbed the dead. At Gokstad, the skeleton was found scattered, incomplete, dragged partly out of its chamber, and significant bones were simply gone. Work on timbers left in the Oseberg robbers' trench has dated that break-in to the middle of the 10th century, within living memory of the burials, in the very years when a new dynasty and, soon, a new religion were tightening their grip on Vestfold. And so a hypothesis has taken shape, argued seriously in the scholarship though not provable, that the openings were not robberies at all in the ordinary sense, but politics. The deliberate public breaking of the old dynasty's monuments, the removal of ancestral bodies and regalia that carried legitimacy, the ritual disarming of the past by men who intended to own the future. In some tellings, an old story preserved in the saga tradition even seems to gesture at such a practice. The strange tale of a man bidden in a dream to break into the mound of Olaf Geirstadr Alf and take from it the dead king's ring and sword and knife, so that they might be given to a newborn who would carry the old king's luck under a new name. Legend, of course, but legend growing in exactly the soil we are describing. A world in which what lay inside a royal mound was understood by everyone to be power, transferable, stealable, dangerous. Whoever they were, thieves in the night or agents of a king, they took the sword and the silver and left the ship, because a ship cannot be carried away in a sack, and by leaving her, they left us everything. After them, the mound closed over its wound, the grass healed, and the long silence resumed. Centuries passed across the top of it. The old gods went out of the fjords, churches rose, the Black Death emptied the farms, and the survivors repeopled them. Norway passed under Danish crowns and Swedish crowns and toward its own again. And through all of it, the mound simply stood, a lump in a field, ploughed around, grazed over. Its name, the King's Mound, carried down the generations as names are, half memory and half habit, long after anyone could have said which king, or when, or why. Children must have played on it. Farmers must have cursed the space it wasted. Perhaps on winter nights, it gathered the stories such mounds always gather in the north. Lights seen, sounds heard, the sense old country people keep that certain ground is occupied, beneath their feet all the while, in the blue clay's cold and airless keeping. The ship rode at her last mooring precisely as she had been left. The shields on her rail, the cauldron by the mast, the horses at their stations, the broken king in his broken chamber. A complete moment of the 9th century, sealed like a ship in a bottle, waiting for the world above to become curious enough and careful enough to deserve it. The world became curious in the winter of 1880. Norway by then was a country in the full flood of national romanticism, a nation still joined to Sweden under a shared crown and increasingly hungry for the evidence of its own separate greatness. And nothing fed that hunger like the Viking past. Antiquarians had been probing mounds for decades. A ship had already come out of one, the Tune ship, found on the eastern side of the fjord a little more than a decade earlier, badly decayed but unmistakably a Viking vessel. The first ever excavated, and educated people across the region knew now what a big coastal mound might hold. The two young men of Gokstad farm knew it too. They were the sons of the household, and the stories say it plainly. It was a season of frost and idleness. The King's Mound stood there as it had always stood, and they began to dig into it for the oldest reason in the world, to see if the stories of treasure were true. They sank their shaft from the top, down through frozen turf and clay, and they had gotten far enough to strike timber, worked timber, ship's timber, when word of what the boys at Gokstad were doing reached the ears of the authorities in the capital. What happened next is one of the quiet heroisms of this story. the president of the Society for the Preservation of Norwegian Ancient Monuments, an antiquarian named Nikolai Nikolaisen, moved at once. He came down to Sandefjord, examined the mound, persuaded the diggers to stop, and secured the site until a proper excavation could begin when the ground opened in the spring. And in doing so, he almost certainly saved the ship, for an amateur treasure shaft driven down through the hull would have wrecked in days what the clay had kept for a millennium. Nikolaisen was not an archaeologist in the modern sense. The modern sense barely existed, but he was careful, experienced, and systematic by the standards of his day. And when work began in earnest at the end of April, he made a decision that mattered enormously. Rather than continue downward from the summit, he opened the mound from the side, driving a broad cutting in toward the center at the level of the old ground surface, so that the ship, whatever her condition, could be approached and uncovered gently from alongside as she lay. 2 days into the digging, the cutting reached her. Out of the wall of blue clay emerged the curve of a great oaken prow, standing up toward the light exactly as it had been left. And the workman and the watching antiquarian understood within moments that this was not another tune ship, not a shadow or a stain of a vessel, but the thing itself, sound wood, tight seams, a ship. The news ran through Norway like weather, and then through the world. Through that spring and summer, as the clay came away bucket by bucket, the mound at Gokstad became a place of pilgrimage. Newspapers reported on it. Crowds took the steamer down the fjord to stand at the edge of the cutting and look. And what they looked at grew more astonishing by the week. The whole long hull taking shape in its trench, the shields still in place along the rail with their black and yellow paint. The burial chamber with its bark shingled roof standing aft of the mast stump. The small boats, the animals, the gear. It is worth standing among that crowd for a moment, in imagination, to feel what they felt. Every one of them had grown up on the sagas. The Viking age was their national poetry, their origin story. And until that summer, it had been, in the strictest material sense, almost invisible. No one alive had ever seen a longship. The ships existed in words, in a few coins and picture stones, in the excited but decayed fragments from tune. Now one stood in the earth in front of them, real as a barn, graceful beyond anything the poems had prepared them for, and old beyond casual comprehension. Visitors wept. Others, it must be recorded, souvenired. Small pieces of the ship went missing into pockets that summer, and the diggers themselves worked under conditions no modern archaeologist could contemplate without a shudder. Much was lost that careful modern methods would have caught. The exact positions of many objects, the fragile organics, the thousand small facts that context alone preserves. Nikolaisen's excavation cleared the entire Great Mound in a single season, a pace that makes today's specialists wince. And yet the essential things were done, and done rightly. The ship was uncovered whole, recorded, and lifted, her surviving timbers cradled, braced, and moved with enormous labor down to the water and up the fjord to the capital, where she came to rest first in a temporary shelter in the university grounds. The bones of the dead man went too, into the collections, along with the shields and the beds, and the cauldron, and the gaming pieces, and all the rest that the 10th century diggers had disdained. Behind them, at Gokstad, the emptied mound was eventually restored to its rounded shape, and it stands there today, green and quiet beside its avenue of trees, holding nothing now but the memory of what it held. The ship's second life had begun, and it would prove to be nearly as eventful as her first. She needed, first of all, to be put back together, for the clay that had preserved her had also pressed her. 1,000 years under the weight of the mound had cracked her keel, spread her bottom, and crushed portions of her sides. And though her oak was sound enough to work with, carpenters could plane it, and it cut like old, hard, living wood. She came out of the ground subtly and everywhere deformed. The first restoration did what the era could do, splinting and supporting and reassembling, returning her to something very close to her original lines, with new timber discreetly supplied where the old was gone. The highest planks at bow and stern, and whatever dragon or beast may once have crowned her stems, had stood above the preserving clay in the looser soil of the mound, and had rotted away entirely, so that the exact profile of her ends, the very silhouette a Viking would have recognized across a harbour, is one more thing we shall never quite certainly know. And while the conservators worked, the ship began her other career, the one no one had planned, as a symbol. It is difficult from this distance to overstate what the Gokstad ship meant to the Norway of the late 19th century. She arrived at the exact moment a small nation was assembling the case for its own independence. And she was better than any argument. She was proof, in solid oak, that this coast had once built the finest ships in the world and sailed them everywhere. She entered the national imagination immediately and completely, pictured, printed, poeticized, reproduced in miniature on 1,000 mantelpieces. And within little more than a decade, she would do something that no other archaeological find has ever quite done. She would go to sea again. Not herself, her timbers would never float again, but in the form of a daughter, built plank for plank in her image, whose voyage would carry the old hull's vindication across the Atlantic Ocean and into the middle of the modern world's loudest celebration of itself. But the hardest and strangest chapters of her afterlife still lay ahead, and to reach them, we must first follow that daughter down the slipway. The idea was born of an insult, or at least of an irritation. As the 1890s opened, the United States was preparing an enormous World's Fair at Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition, to mark 4 centuries since the voyage of Columbus. And among its planned spectacles were reproductions of Columbus's own 3 ships, to be sailed across from Spain in honor of the man the age credited with finding America. In Norway, where every schoolchild now knew the saga's account of Leif Erikson and the Vineland voyages, and where the Gokstad ship stood as fresh proof of what Norse hulls had been, this framing did not sit well. A newspaper editor and champion of Norwegian seafaring, named Magnus Andersen, himself a master mariner who had once attempted the Atlantic in an open lifeboat, took up the cause. Norway would answer the caravels with a Viking ship. Not a fantasy, not a theatrical prop, but an exact replica of the Gokstad find, built by Norwegian shipwrights in the old manner, and sailed, not shipped as freight, across the North Atlantic to Chicago, along what the sagas allowed one to imagine as the old route, to remind the celebrating world who had actually crossed first. Money was raised by subscription, much of it in small amounts from ordinary people. A yard at Fjord, within sight of the ship's own burial ground, laid the keel, and through the winter into the spring of 1893, there took shape on the stocks a vessel that no living tradition had built for perhaps 8 centuries. 78 feet of clinker-laid oak, 16 strakes aside, the lashed frames, the fish-shaped mast partner, the side rudder on its plaited withy, every essential of the original repeated, with only such quiet concessions to the voyage as prudence demanded. A few discreet reinforcements, provisions stowed where a king's grave goods had lain. They named her, simply, Viking. She left Norway at the end of April with a crew of 12, Andersen commanding, and stood out into the North Atlantic. And for the next 4 weeks, she gave the world a demonstration that settled, forever and in the most public way possible, a question scholars had genuinely debated: whether the graceful hulls in the burial mounds had really been ocean-going ships at all, or merely coastal craft flattered by legend. The Atlantic did not spare her. She met heavy weather, days of great following seas, in which the little ship ran surfing down the faces with the helmsman fighting the tiller. And it was here, in the worst of it, that Anderson made the observations that have been quoted in the literature of ship archaeology ever since. He watched the hull work. He recorded that, in a seaway, the bottom of the ship flexed visibly with the waves, the gunwale twisting measurably out of line and back, the whole fabric breathing exactly as the lashed construction intended. And that far from opening her seams, this elasticity seemed to be the very secret of her ease, the ship yielding to the sea instead of being battered by it, and remaining, through everything, remarkably watertight. He praised the side rudder without reservation. Light, quick, effective, a brilliant device that one man could handle, in conditions that would have exhausted a helmsman on a conventional wheel or heavy stern rudder. And he logged her speed, at her best, with a strong fair wind, around 10 knots, and by some accounts touching 11. Faster, as delighted Norwegian newspapers did not fail to observe, than the replica caravels. 28 days out from Bergen, Viking made her landfall on the coast of Newfoundland, an open Norse hull raising the New World again, more or less 9 centuries after the last one had left it, and then came down the seaboard to New York, where the harbour filled with steam whistles and excursion boats to meet her, and onward by stages up the Hudson, through the canals and the Great Lakes, to Chicago, where she arrived to a welcome that by all accounts overwhelmed even her champions, saluted by warships, cheered by crowds in the hundreds of thousands. The crew fated from city to city. Whatever the fair's organizers had intended, the Norwegians had made their point so thoroughly that it has never really needed making again. The ships of the mounds were ocean ships, and the saga's western voyages were, at the very least, entirely possible in the hulls the sagas described. When the reconstructed Norse site at the tip of Newfoundland was excavated in the 20th century, and the Vinland voyages passed from saga into archaeology, the Vikings' crossing stood retrospectively as the sea trial that had predicted it. The replica herself, it is pleasant to record, still exists, preserved ashore near Chicago, cared for through many vicissitudes by devoted volunteers, the oldest daughter of the Gokstad ship, and the only one to have tasted the original's own element in anger. Back in Norway, meanwhile, the original was outgrowing her temporary shelters. For decades after the excavation, she stood in sheds in the university grounds in the capital, visited, studied, venerated, but housed like a boat in winter storage rather than like what she had become, which was nothing less than the central object of Norwegian national identity. The finding of the Oseberg ship in 1904, with its unparalleled treasury of carved wood, made the problem acute. The young country, fully independent at last from the year following, now possessed the 2 greatest ship finds in the world, and nowhere worthy to put them. The answer, argued over for years in the way such things are argued, rose at last on the Bygdøy Peninsula across the harbour from the city. A purpose-built hall in the form of a whitewashed cross, austere and luminous as a church, designed around the ships themselves. One great vessel to each arm, the Gokstad ship taking her place in the light of her own vaulted gallery in the 1930s. Riding on her supports at eye level so that visitors approached her almost as swimmers, looking up along the run of her strakes. Anyone who has stood there will tell you the effect is not that of a museum. People lower their voices. The building was conceived as a shrine, and it behaves like one, and for the better part of a century, the Gokstad ship has received her visitors there. Millions upon millions of them, from every country on earth, filing slowly around the black sheen of her hull. While outside, the world she was built in receded another lifetime into the past. And still her story was not done accumulating chapters, for the man who had been buried in her was about to have the strangest afterlife of all. The bones of the Gokstad chieftain had come up from the mound in 1880 along with everything else, and had gone into the anatomical collections of the capital, where the science of the day examined them and pronounced its findings. A large, powerfully built man, mature in years. And there, for a time, they rested, until Norway, in the full flush of its new independence, decided that a king of the old blood ought not to lie in a specimen drawer. In the late 1920s, in a gesture that tells us as much about that era as the original burial tells us about its own, the bones were returned to Gokstad and interred again in the restored mound. Sealed, this time, inside a monumental sarcophagus of stone and heavy metal, sunk into the hill with solemn ceremony, the modern nation reburying the ancient chieftain as a founding ancestor. It was reverent, it was patriotic, and it was, from the standpoint of science, very nearly a catastrophe of good intentions. Because within a few generations, the questions researchers most wanted to ask of those bones could only be answered by instruments that did not exist in the 1920s, and the bones were under several feet of clay inside a welded box. It took years of application and argument before, early in our own century, permission was granted to open the mound a second time and bring the chieftain out again. And this time, the examination was conducted with everything the modern laboratory could bring to bear. It was this re-examination that transformed our picture of the man. Where the 19th century had seen simply a big skeleton, the new analysis, led by specialists in ancient human remains, saw the details we have already encountered: the extraordinary robustness, the probable age around 40, the signs suggesting to some researchers a hormonal condition that may have driven his unusual growth. And, above everything, the cuts, the unhealed weapon wounds to both legs that rewrote his death from the vague sickness of tradition into the specific violence of an edged and final hour. Samples of his bone have since entered the great ongoing genetic surveys of the Viking age. And so the man from the mound, robbed of his name, his sword, and his silver, has ended by giving the future something none of the robbers could reach: the code of his own body, deposited in the archives of science beside the timber of his ship. He rests now, it should be said, no longer in the mound but in safekeeping among the national collections, his third residence in 11 centuries, while the mound at Gokstad stands green and whole, again above the empty clay. Nor had the site itself finished speaking. For 130 years after Nicolaison's season, everyone assumed the mound had given up all it had. The ship was the find, and the field around it merely a field. Then, early in the 21st century's second decade, archaeologists returned to Gokstad with the instruments of a new age: ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, the whole silent toolkit that lets the modern researcher see beneath turf without lifting it. And the field around the King's Mound turned out to be anything but empty. The surveys and the careful excavations that followed revealed, spread across the plain between the mound and the vanished shoreline, the traces of a whole vanished place: rows of building plots along a road, the post holes of workshops, hearths, and, sown through the soil, the unglamorous, unmistakable litter of commerce: weights for scales, fragments of silver coins struck in the Islamic East, and cut for bullion, beads, whetstones, the debris of craft production. Here, within sight of the chieftain's grave, had stood a trading site, a small port of the very world of exchange that had brought the peacock and the gold-shot silk into the burial chamber. The discovery quietly reframed the whole monument. The mound was not raised in lonely majesty on an empty shore, but at the edge of a working place, above the masts and smoke and haggling of a landing where routes converged. The dead lord set, deliberately, where the living traffic that had made him rich would pass beneath his hill for generations. Power in that world did not retire to the wilderness. It sat down beside the money, even in death. And while the archaeologists worked in the field, another team was at work on the ship herself, in a long campaign of study and rescue that continues as this is spoken. For the melancholy truth of all the great ship finds is that excavation starts a clock, Wood that has reached equilibrium in wet clay begins, once lifted into the air, a slow second decay. The old conservation treatments of a century ago, brilliant for their time, are aging. The timbers carry their own weight now, in a way they were never asked to underwater or underground. And instruments attached to the hulls in recent decades have recorded what the eye cannot see. Creeping, cumulative deformation, the ship sagging by fractions of a millimeter against her supports, year upon year. The response has been one of the great slow endeavors of modern museum science. Every fragment scanned and modeled, new support systems engineered to carry the hull as gently as water once did. And, rising around the old cross-shaped shrine on Bygdøy, an entirely new museum, larger, climate-stable, built expressly so that the Gokstad ship and her sisters can be kept not merely for another generation, but, its makers hope, for centuries. The ship's to stand at its heart, moved with a delicacy and an anxiety that would have bemused the men who once hauled this same hull over greased logs with ropes and shouting. It is a strange symmetry when one steps back to see it. 1100 years ago, a community poured out its labor to move this ship a few hundred yards and seal her against time, for reasons of reverence. Today, another community pours out its labor, engineers, chemists, conservators, whole careers, to move her a few dozen yards and seal her against time, for reasons of reverence. The gods invoked differ. The gesture is the same. She has that effect on people, and she always has. Of all the objects her age left behind, none has ever been so consistently treated, by robbers and romantics and nations and scientists alike, as something more than a thing. But why a ship at all? We have followed this one vessel from forest to museum, and yet the strangest fact about her story is one we have so far taken for granted. That her people, faced with the death of a king, reached for a ship as the proper furniture of eternity. It wasn't an isolated impulse, and pausing here, in the quiet middle of the night, it is worth drawing back to see how wide and how old the custom was. The custom of sending the dead to sea in the earth. Ship burial, in one form or another, runs through the whole northern world for half a millennium and more. Long before Gokstad, in the early 7th century, the East Anglians of Britain, a people whose ancestors had themselves crossed from the continent in rowing ships of the Nidum kind, dragged a vessel some 90 feet long up from their river and buried a king in it under a great mound at a place called Sutton Hoo, with a helmet and regalia that stunned the modern world when the mound was opened. The ship itself had dissolved utterly in the acid sand, surviving only as a ghost, a perfect shadow of stains and rows of rusted rivets, so that England possesses the imprint of a great early ship and Norway the ship itself, and the two finds have illuminated each other ever since. Across Scandinavia, the practice appears in every scale. Kings and queens in ocean-going vessels under monumental mounds, prosperous farmers in small boats under modest ones, and, in the hundreds, humbler graves where the dead were laid in a few feet of clinker-built dinghy, or merely within an outline of stones set in the shape of a hull. The poor man's ship, a vessel of granite that could carry the idea, if not the body, of seafaring into the dark. At Ladby in Denmark, a chieftain's longship was buried with its dragon-ornamented stem and its anchor. In the burial grounds of the trading towns, merchants were laid in boats with their scales and weights, and in the graves of certain women. For ship burial was never only for men, as the magnificence of Oseberg proves above all. The vessel served just as readily. Nor was burial the only form. The written sources, and some of the archaeology, speak also of ship cremation. The dead laid aboard with their goods, and the whole sent to the fire. Around the very years the Gokstad mound was rising, an Arab diplomat named Ibn Fadlan, travelling on the Volga far to the east, watched the funeral of a chieftain of the Rus, Norse traders operating on the river routes, and wrote down what he saw with the appalled precision of an outsider. The ship drawn up on the shore, the dead man dressed in splendor and seated aboard, the sacrifices, and at last the burning, the whole ship and everything in it, consumed in a great wind-driven blaze, after which his hosts explained to him, through an interpreter, and with evident pity for Arab burial customs, that fire carried the dead to paradise in an hour, while the earth's slow way took ages. His account is the only surviving eyewitness description of a Norse ship funeral, and though it comes from the far end of the Norse world and must be handled with care, it opens a window onto the beliefs that all these graves imply and never state. For the mounds themselves are wordless. No rune stone at Gokstad explains the rite. No 9th century voice tells us whether the ship was meant to carry the dead man on an actual voyage to an actual other world, or whether it was his proudest possession honored beside him, or his station and rank made permanent, or all of these at once, blurred together as human symbols usually are. The mythology the Norse wrote down centuries later, after conversion, is full of ships in exactly this register of meaning. The gods themselves give the dead Balder, best and most beloved of them, a ship funeral. His body burned aboard his own vessel at the sea's edge with all the worlds in mourning. The ship Skidbladnir, finest of all craft, belongs to the god of harvests and can be folded like cloth when not needed. And at the end of all things, the myths say, a ship called Naglfar, built of the untrimmed nails of the dead, will carry the forces of ruin to the last battle, an image that has made more than one listener think differently about the care with which the living groomed their dead. Whether the people who buried the Gokstad chieftain held these exact stories, we cannot know. The versions we possess were written by Christians in Iceland 300 years later, but that ships sailed through the center of their imagination of death. That much the earth of Vestfold states outright, in oak. And there may have been, mixed into the reverence, something plainer and more political, which the modern eye is perhaps better placed to see than the romantic 19th century was. A ship of the Gokstad class was among the most expensive objects her society could produce. The trees, the labor, the iron, the enormous woolen sail, the accumulated skill, the rough equivalent, in her world, of what a great estate or a warship would be in later ones. To take such a thing out of use forever, to bury wealth on that scale in front of the whole district, was a demonstration. This house can afford to throw away a fleet's flagship, mourn appropriately, and commission another. Anthropologists have a name for such magnificent destruction, and every age has its versions of it. The mound made the loss permanent and public and visible from the sea lanes, so that every passing hull for generations sailed under the statement it made. Grief, faith, and power. Politics need not be untangled. In a royal funeral they never are, in any century. What is certain is that the custom faded exactly when the world that needed it faded. As Christianity moved up the fjords through the 10th and 11th centuries, ship burial ended. The new faith buried its dead in consecrated ground, shipless, facing the sunrise. And the mounds became what they would remain for 800 years. The unread archives of the old religion, grassed over, gathering stories. The Gokstad ship was among the last and grandest entries in that archive. She was sealed into the ground by very nearly the final generation for whom such an act was thinkable. A lifetime or two later, no one would ever bury a great ship in Scandinavia again, which means the mound preserves not only a vessel, but a worldview at the moment of its high tide. The last full expression of an idea, thousands of years old, that the proper vehicle of a soul is a hull. And still, before we let her rest, we owe a debt to the things and the hands this story has so far kept in the background. For a ship is never only her timber, and the Gokstad ship carried into the earth the work of far more people than her builders. Consider first the iron. A hull of the Gokstad kind was held together by rivets, round-headed iron nails driven through the overlapping planks from outside and clenched inside over small square plates called roves. And she carried them in the thousands. Modern reconstructions of ships her size have required several thousand rivets and many hundredweight of iron, and every ounce of it in the 9th century had to be won from the land by a process nearly as laborious as the shipbuilding itself. Norway has no iron mines to speak of in the modern sense. What it has, in vast quantities, is bog ore, iron precipitated in nodules in the marshes and lakebeds of the forest country. And the winning of it was an industry of the inland valleys, ore dug and roasted, charcoal burned in pits by the ton, small clay furnaces built and fed and broken open, the spongy blooms of raw iron hammered and folded and hammered again to drive out the slag. Archaeologists have mapped the traces of this industry across the uplands, and its scale in the Viking Age is startling. Whole districts, far from any salt water, spent their winters making the metal that the coast spun into rivets, axes, and blades. When we look along the shadowed line of a Gokstad strake, we are looking at the forest bogs of the interior, at charcoal smoke over winter valleys, at an economy reaching hundreds of miles inland from the sea. Consider the tar. Every plank of her was treated with it, every seam caulked with hair dipped in it. The dark sheen that the sagas praise on ships' sides was pine tar, and it too was made, not found. Whole resinous pine stumps and roots slow-burned in earth-covered kilns until the tar ran out through channels into waiting vessels. Recent archaeology in Sweden has uncovered tar kilns of the Viking Age at a scale that astonished the excavators. Pits capable of producing tar by the hundreds of litres in a single firing, industrial quantities far beyond household need, and their date and size track exactly with the age of the great fleets. Someone, in other words, was producing naval stores in bulk in the 8th and 9th centuries. The raiding and trading of the age floated on an unrecorded chemical industry in the pine forests, and the Gokstad ship wore its product from keel to rail. Consider the rope. Walrus hide cut in spirals for the hardest working stays, lime bast retted and twisted for the running gear, heather and pine root where they served, and the wool grease, and the paint on the shields, and the horn of the gaming pieces, and each thread of this leads outward into another set of hands, another patch of the landscape, another skill with its own apprenticeships and secrets. But above all, consider the sail, because the sail is the great hidden monument of the whole Viking Age, and the people who made it are the age's great unlisted workforce. A square sail for a ship of the Gokstad class ran to roughly 100 square meters of cloth, or, in the older measure, well over 1,000 square feet, woven of wool. Scholars who have worked the numbers through, from sheep to fleece to spun thread to finished, smored, strengthened sailcloth, arrive at figures that permanently change how one sees these ships. The fleeces of many scores of sheep, or by some calculations, well over 100, for a single great sail. And in labour, thousands upon thousands of hours of sorting, combing, spinning and weaving, so that by several serious estimates, the sail of a longship represented as much working time as the hull itself, or more. And in the world of the 9th century North, textile work was women's work. The spinning that filled every winter evening of every farm, the great upright looms that stood in every hall, weighted with the donut-shaped loomstones that archaeologists find by the basketful wherever Norse people lived. Which means the plain arithmetic of the age is this. For every crew of raiders whose names the chronicles cursed, there stood behind them, uncursed and unrecorded, a larger company of women whose fingers had made the voyage possible, whose thread, quite literally, drove the ship. The wind pushed the sail was years of spinning, The Viking age was woven before it was sailed. The Gokstad burial itself contains the quiet signature of this world of women's work in its fragments of cloth, its bedding, its fine textiles, and in the strips sewn to the remains of what may have been the sail itself, found folded aboard. And a dozen miles away, the Oseberg grave, where two women, not a man, received the greatest ship burial ever found, contained looms and weaving tools among its treasures, as if to state outright that this too was the equipment of power. And consider finally the trees again, because from this distance we can see something about them that the builders could not. The oak forest that built the Gokstad ship was itself a kind of inheritance, centuries of standing capital accumulated on the hillsides of southern Scandinavia, and the shipbuilding cultures of Europe would spend the next 1,000 years drawing that capital down. By the late Middle Ages, and catastrophically by the age of the great navies, the old oak forests of the north and west were thinned to memory. The mature, straight, slow-grown giants that a Vestfold master could once select at need became strategic resources fought over by admiralties, and a hull that a 9th century district could conjure from its own woods would have strained the timber purveyance of kingdoms. When modern Scandinavian craftsmen set out, in our own era, to build faithful replicas of the great finds, one of their first discoveries was botanical. Trees of the old dimensions and quality are now genuinely hard to find, and the search for a single keel oak can take longer than the felling of a whole ship's timber took 11 centuries ago. The Gokstad ship, in other words, is a document of her forests as much as of her builders, a slice of an ecosystem at its unspent height, preserved in the one place, the clay where neither shipwrights nor navies nor sawmills could ever get at it again. Hull, rivets, tar, rope, sail, forest, put them all together and the ship reveals herself, finally, for what she truly was in her own time. Not an object that a genius made, but a settlement that a whole society reached. The point where the bogs and the pine woods and the sheep pastures and the oak hills and the halls full of spinning women and the smoky yards full of hammering men all converged into a single black-sided, gold-shielded, breathing shape on the water. Nothing about her was casual. Everything about her was connected to everything else. Her people put their world into her, and then, when their king died, they gave their world back to the ground, and the ground, uniquely, kept the receipt. To understand why so much of that world's wealth came to rest in this particular corner of it, we should take one slow look at the landscape around the mound, because Vestfold in the 9th century was not merely a district that happened to contain a rich grave. It was one of the great theatres of power in the north, and the Gokstad ship is only the most perfect survivor of a whole countryside of monuments. Follow the western shore of the fjord, and the evidence comes in procession. Northward up the coast lies Bora, where a line of enormous burial mounds, one of the largest mound cemeteries in Scandinavia, stands in parkland above the water, raised across the generations for what must have been a dynasty. The sagas remembered Bora as a burial place of the Yngling kings, and archaeology, which found ship rivets in one of its plundered mounds more than a century and a half ago, has steadily deepened the picture, adding the traces of enormous halls nearby, buildings fit for royal assembly. A short way inland from Gokstad itself rose the farm and, in time, the estate structures, whose name the sagas give as Gokstad, seat of the Olaf, around whom the identity debate turns. Across a low neck of land to the north lies Oseberg, where the ornate ship of the two women went into its mound within living memory of people who might have watched the Gokstad funeral. Across the fjord to the east, the Tune ship guarded the opposite shore, and down at the coast's edge, on a sheltered bay, lay Kaupang, the market, the closest thing Norway then had to a town. Rows of plots and jetties where excavation has recovered the residue of trade, with half the known world. Coins from the Caliphate, pottery from the Rhineland, jewelry scrap, amber, the floor sweepings of a 9th century emporium. Set these places on a map, and the region reads like a single connected statement. Markets to make wealth, halls to gather it, ships to move and defend it, and mounds, always within sight of water, to proclaim it after death. Whoever ruled here ruled one of the choke points of northern commerce, where the traffic of the Baltic bent around the coast toward the west, and the great graves are the dividend of that position paid out across a century. This is the immediate world the Gokstad chieftain moved through, a landscape of perhaps a few days' travel, end to end, dense with kin, rivals, dependents, and the dead. And it was a world in its final generation of independence, though no one in it could have known that with certainty. The story that later tradition tells of these exact decades is the story of Harald Fairhair, the young king from the uplands and the west, who, the sagas say, vowed never to cut his hair until all Norway lay under him, and who, in a long career of battle and marriage and calculated terror, culminating in a great sea fight at Fjord, made himself something no one in the north had been before. King, at least in name, of the whole long coast. Modern historians handle Harald carefully. The written sources are late, the chronology is soft, and some scholars doubt whether his overlordship reached everywhere tradition claims, Vestfold included, where the influence of the powerful Danish kings to the south may have mattered as much or more. But whatever the exact mechanics, the direction of the age is not in doubt. The 9th century's crowd of local kings, men precisely of the Gokstad chieftain's kind, was thinning, generation by generation, into subjects, exiles, or ancestors. Some fought and drowned in the new order's harbours. Some sailed away rather than kneel. The settlement traditions of Iceland are full of proud men who are said to have left Norway to escape Harald's hand. And whether or not each tale is true, the pattern of emigration is archaeological fact. And some died at home, in whatever local struggles the great consolidation stirred up, and were buried by their households with a magnificence that reads, from this distance, almost like protest. The old world spending itself into the ground rather than be inherited. It is against this background that the Gokstad burial acquires its full and slightly melancholy resonance. Here is a man of the last free generation of the old order, dead of violence around the very years the sagas assign to the wars of unification, buried not with the modesty of a subject, but with the full royal right of the Vestfold coast, ship and horses and hounds and hawks and shielded rail. His mound raised beside the trading place that had been his family's fortune, on the shore of a political world that was closing over his kind like water. Within a few decades, if the reading of the break-ins is right, agents of the new order would come back to that mound and strip it of the regalia that made it dangerous. Within a few generations, the religion that gave the rite its meaning would itself be dismantled. The mound at Gokstad may therefore be something more poignant than a rich grave. It may be a full-dress funeral for an entire political and spiritual order, conducted by people who could feel the tide turning under them. The old Vestfold burying its last king in the grand manor, while the grand manor still meant anything at all. We cannot prove that reading. The mound, as always, keeps its counsel. But history did, in fact, turn out that way. The independent sea kings went, the unified kingdom came, the church came after it. And of everything that vanished in that turning, almost nothing physical survived above ground. What survived was below it. One ship's length of the 9th century, upholstered in blue clay, riding out the millennium while dynasties and doctrines washed over the grass. There is a long, quiet irony in the fact that the new order's mound breakers, so thorough with the sword and the silver, never imagined that the most subversive treasure in the grave was the hull they left behind. That 1100 years later, It would be the defeated chieftain's ship, and not the victor's chronicles, that taught the world what his age had actually been. What his age had actually been is a lesson the ship is still teaching, because the Gokstad find did not merely enter a museum, it founded a discipline. Before the summer of 1880, the study of Viking ships was the study of texts and pictures, saga descriptions written centuries after the fact, stylized carvings on Gotland's picture stones, the embroidered fleet crossing the Bayeux tapestry, and from such materials, scholars could argue almost anything, and did. After Gokstad, there was a specimen, a complete hull whose every scarf and rivet could be measured. And from her, the modern science of ship archaeology descends as directly as the replica Viking descended down her slipway. It was Gokstad that established the basic grammar scholars still use, the terminology of strakes and Megenhofer and mast partner, the understanding of shell-first clinker construction, the recognition of the lashed frame technique, and every subsequent find has been read, in the first instance, against her. And the finds came. Oseberg, in the new century's first years, added the art and the astonishing carving. Then, decades later, and in another country, came the discovery that widened the whole picture. In a channel of Roskilde fjord in Denmark, fishermen's tales of an old wreck on a shallow bar proved to conceal not one ship, but 5, deliberately filled with stones and sunk side by side in the 11th century to block the seaway against raiders. A barrier made of retired ships, excavated at last inside a purpose-built cofferdam in a campaign that became legendary in the field. The 5 Skuldelev ships, as they are known from the place, were fragmentary where Gokstad was whole, but they were something Gokstad couldn't be. A fleet in cross-section, 5 different answers to 5 different needs. A great longship of war, a smaller levy warship, a stout ocean-going cargo nar, a coastal trader, and a smaller boat, showing at a stroke that the tradition was not a single design but a language, spoken in dialects for every purpose. Around the museum built for them at Roskilde, there then grew the thing that has perhaps taught most of all, a working shipyard dedicated to experimental archaeology, where every one of the 5 has been rebuilt full-scale with period tools and methods, and then sailed hard in open water. The great warship's reconstruction crossing the North Sea to Ireland and back in a voyage that tested crew and hull to their limits and returned with notebooks full of data no manuscript could ever have yielded. Real speeds, real leeway, real handling in real gales, the actual number of hands needed, the actual misery and capability of the thing. The Gokstad ship stands at the head of that whole enterprise, and she has continued to contribute to it directly. For Viking of 1893 proved to be only the first of her daughters. Through the 20th century and into our own, replicas of the Gokstad hull have been built again and again, in Norway and far beyond, and sailed on every kind of trial. One of them, in the early 1990s, crossed the Atlantic in company to mark the millennium of the Vinland voyages, repeating Anderson's demonstration with modern instrumentation aboard. Others have served as training ships, film ships, festival ships, and floating classrooms. Each of them has added its increment to the sum of understanding, and the sum is remarkably consistent. The design is fast, sea-kindly, weatherly for a square rigger, dry beyond expectation, and dependent above all on crew skill. A boat that rewards the practiced and punishes the casual, exactly as one would expect of a tradition in which every builder was also a sailor. The replicas have also, inevitably, mapped the edges of our ignorance, and honesty requires that we walk those edges before this story closes. We do not know, first, exactly how her ends rose and finished, because the uppermost timbers of stem and stern rotted in the looser soil above the clay. Whether she carried a beast's head, a spiral, or a plain cutwater is reconstruction, not record. The dragonheads of the popular imagination rest on other evidence, on picture stones and later ships and the sagas, not on anything found at Gokstad. We do not know the details of her rigging. No mast top, no certain block pattern, no complete rope survived, and every replica's rig is a scholarly argument made of hemp. We do not know how her sail was cut, coloured or trimmed, and the lively modern research into Viking sailcloth, including the weaving of full sails from hand-spun wool to test the old estimates, is precisely that. Research, converging but not concluded. We do not know her name, her ports, her voyages, her crews. And we do not know, and likely never will, the thing every visitor most wants to know, the name of her king. The temptation, in a story like this one, is to paper over such gaps with the confident voice of narration. The discipline the ship herself founded demands the opposite, and the honest map of Gokstad scholarship is therefore a bright continent of certainty, her timber, her construction, her dates, her capability, surrounded by a sea of carefully labelled unknowns. That is not a weakness of the story. It is the condition of all real knowledge about the deep past. And one of the quiet gifts of lying here in the dark with an 1100-year-old ship is the permission it gives to rest inside open questions. To let the unknown simply remain unknown, without anxiety, the way the sea remains, the sea beyond the last charted sounding. The ship has waited 1,000 years. Her secrets are in no hurry, and neither, tonight, are we. And yet, in one sense, the tradition that built her never entirely ended. And this may be the gentlest turn in her whole story. The great longships themselves passed away with the world that needed them. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, the war fleets of the northern kings grew taller and heavier. The light raiding hull gave way, slowly, to floating fortresses of a newer age. And in the harbours of trade, the descendants of the Nar found themselves competing with, and then yielding to, a rival design from the south. The cog, the high-sided, flat-bottomed workhorse of the German towns, ancestor of the deep bluff merchantmen that would carry Europe's later centuries. By the end of the Middle Ages, the ship of the Gokstad kind was gone from the registers of war and commerce, and shipbuilding's main current had turned decisively toward the skeleton first, carvel-planked construction out of which galleons and frigates and clippers would come. But the main current was never the whole river. In the fjords and along the island coasts of Norway, in the Faroes, in Shetland, wherever the sea remained what it had been in the 9th century, a working neighbour to be crossed daily in an open boat. The old way of building simply carried on at the scale of daily life. The fishing boats of western and northern Norway, built by eye, shell first, of thin overlapping strakes on widely spaced frames. Light enough to haul out, lively and sea-kindly under their single square sails, well into the age of photography, are the direct lineal descendants of the Gokstad ship's small boats. Set one of the famous northern fishing craft of the 19th century beside the largest of the Gokstad tenders. And the family resemblance needs no expert to see it, 1,000 years notwithstanding. Boat builders in those districts, some of them still working today, inherited through unbroken chains of apprenticeship the very judgments, the reading of grain, the trimming of a strake's edge by eye, the feel for how much a hull should flex, that we watched being exercised on a Vestfold foreshore near the beginning of this story. And in our own century, that living inheritance, the Nordic clinker boat tradition entire, has been formally recognized on the world's registers of intangible cultural heritage, which is a bureaucratic way of saying what the boats themselves say more gracefully, that something begun before written memory in these waters is still alive in them. When the shipwrights of the replica projects needed to relearn the Viking methods, it was to these last traditional builders, as much as to the archaeologists, that they went. The knowledge had never wholly died, only narrowed, like a river in a dry season, waiting. There is something restful in that thought, that the Gokstad ship is not the relic of an extinct art, but the grandest single specimen of a craft that never stopped being practiced within sight of the waters she sailed. And alongside the working inheritance runs the imaginative one, which has been stranger and not always as happy, and which honesty asks us to acknowledge quietly before we return to the ship herself. From the moment she came out of the mound, the Gokstad ship was pressed into service as a symbol, and symbols are conscripted by whoever needs them. For the young Norway of the late 19th century, she meant proof of nationhood, and that meaning was, on the whole, benign. She presided, in spirit, over the peaceful dissolution of the union with Sweden and the coronation of an independent kingdom. And Norwegians to this day carry her image on money and stamps and the national imagination. But the Viking past proved usable by darker projects as well. In the middle of the 20th century, occupying powers and their ideologies draped themselves in northern antiquity, mound sites were exploited for propaganda ceremonies, and the great ships were made to gesture toward racial myths their builders could never have conceived. That chapter passed, scholarship reclaimed the ground, and the ships themselves, of course, were never anything but innocent. Oak has no politics. Yet the episode is worth its one quiet sentence in this story, as a reminder of what the ship has had to be for people, century after century, whatever they most needed the past to say. The truest resistance to all such conscription has been the patient work we have already followed. The tree ring counters and bone readers and textile weavers and replica sailors who keep returning the ship from the realm of symbol to the realm of fact, where she is more interesting than any myth. For consider what the facts, soberly assembled, actually amount to. A society without writing to speak of, without mathematics beyond tally and proportion, without saws, without plans, working entirely by inherited eye and hand, produced an ocean-going vessel whose hydrodynamics satisfy modern naval architects. Organized around that capability, a web of movement that touched 4 continents' margins. And then, in an act combining engineering, theatre, and faith, installed its finest machine in the ground so precisely that 11 centuries later it could be lifted out and read like a book. Almost every phrase of that sentence would have sounded like romance 150 years ago. Every phrase of it is now documented. That is the Gokstad ship's most durable cargo. The demonstration, delivered whole into the modern world, that the people of the northern 9th century were neither the demons of the monastic chronicles nor the supermen of the national romances, but something more impressive than either, masters of an exacting craft, embedded in a wide and busy world, capable of subtlety and capable of violence, fully as human as ourselves, and, in the one art that mattered most to them, arguably better at it than anyone alive today. The chronicles cursed them, the romantics gilded them, the clay all the while was keeping the evidence. Before that last long look, though, the smallest members of the burial deserve a few unhurried minutes of their own, because in the shadow of the great ship, it is easy to pass over the 3 little boats that went into the mound with her, and they repay attention as richly, in their own scale, as she does in hers. They were found lying with the ship, dismantled or crushed by the weight of the mound, but recoverable. And when they were studied and restored, they proved to be, in the judgment of more than one scholar who has written about them, among the finest small craft surviving from any period of the past, built with the same shell-first clinker technique as their mother ship, the same radially split oak, the same rivets and lashings and economy, but refined down to a delicacy that the big hull with an ocean to face could not afford. The largest of the 3 ran to something over 30 feet, a boat for 8 or 10 oars, itself a serious little vessel that could carry a landing party or a load of stores through open water. The middle one somewhat smaller, and the smallest, a light faring-type boat of the kind 2 men could run up a beach. Its planking hewn so thin, in places well under an inch, that the restorers handled it like the shell of an egg, their strakes number few. Broad planks, brilliantly shaped, doing with 3 or 4 courses what lesser builders would need 6 to accomplish. And their lines are so sweet that naval architects have taken them off and published them like the lines of yachts. Set beside the great ship, they complete her in the way a house's small rooms complete its hall. She was never meant to be alone, and a lord's fleet, even in death, kept its proportions, flagship and tenders, the whole establishment afloat. And around the boats, the objects, and here too, the mound's quiet inventory rewards a slow inventory of our own, item by item, because each is a sentence about the life it served. The great bronze cauldron, wide enough to feed dozens, with its iron tripod and chain, a portable hearth, the social center of every beach camp this crew ever made, and a statement in expensive imported metal that this household fed many mouths, the wooden trenchers and cups, plain and worn, the other end of the same meals, the candle stand of iron, and the remains of what the excavators judged to be wax candles, light itself, packed for the journey. And wax candles in the 9th century North were no small luxury. The 6 beds, ranging from the fine carved pair in the chamber to plainer frames stowed forward that could be taken apart and laid flat aboard ship. Furniture designed, like everything else in this world, to travel. The sledge, waiting for snow in whatever country the dead inhabit. The riding gear and the gilded harness mounts, some of them, scholars have noted, of workmanship with parallels far to the south, plunder or purchase or gift from the wide world. The iron fish hooks, a touching item in a king's grave, as if whoever packed it could not imagine even a royal eternity without a line over the side. The 64 shields, of thin soft wood boards that would have stopped little without their rawhide facing, made, perhaps expressly for the funeral, some have argued, given their lightness, to make the ship magnificent one final time. And the gaming board, marked out on both faces for different games, with its pieces, perhaps the most quietly human object in the whole assemblage, because a gaming board in a grave says, more plainly than any monument, that these people thought of death as time. Long time, evening time, time that would need filling, in company, beside some fire in some hall on the other side of everything. Archaeologists are trained to call such objects grave goods and to read them as status, ritual, ideology, and they are all of those things. But stand over the cases where they lie, and a simpler reading keeps rising through the scholarly one. Somebody packed. Somebody who knew this man went through the household in the days after his death and chose this bed, not that one. The good cauldron, his own gaming pieces, candles, hooks, the boats he would need for the shallow water wherever he was going. Performing with the whole solemn machinery of religion around them, the same homely act performed at every departure since departures began, making sure the traveller had what he would need, and maybe 1 or 2 things he would simply want. 11 centuries later, we cannot know a single name in that household. But we know their thinking, because we have their packing, complete, in the very order of their care. There are documents from the 9th century, charters, chronicles, letters of kings, and most of them tell us less about how it actually felt to be a person then than this one wordless manifest of a dead lord's luggage. That too is part of what the clay was keeping. All those centuries, under the children's games and the passing plagues. Not just the largest artifact of the age, but its most intimate. The difference between history, which is what happened, and the past, which is what it was like. The ship gives us both at once, hull and cargo, the grand and the homely lashed into the same trench. And it is with both in mind that we should take our leave of her. So let us go back to her one more time, slowly and simply look, the long last look this whole night has been earning, because there is a way of seeing the Gokstad ship that only comes after her story is known, and it is the way the room where she stands seems designed to teach. Picture the hall in the quiet hours, white vaulted plaster, high windows, the light falling the length of a black hull raised on its cradle so that her keel rides at the height of your chest. Approach her from the bow, and the first thing that reaches you is the sheer line, the long, taut curve of her rail sweeping up from amidships toward the rising stem. A line with nothing accidental in it anywhere, drawn by a dead man's eye across 78 feet of air. Come closer, and the hull resolves into its parts. The shadowed steps of the 16 strakes, each overlap a crisp, dark line running the ship's whole length. The ordered constellation of rivet heads, thousands of them, each one a hammer's morning. The oarports in their neat rank with their little shutters, some still swiveled as hands left them. The wear here and there that no restorer has erased, because the wear is the biography. Lay your eye along a strake. The museum will not let you lay your hand, and rightly, but the eye is enough. And the oak answers with the low luster that 1,000 years in clay and a century of care have given it. A colour for which the only honest word is deep. Not black, not brown, but the shade of time itself when time has been kind. Walk aft. Amidships, the great humped mast partner crouches over the keelson like the animal its makers half carved it into. The mast stump stands in its slot, cut down for the burial, its severed grain still plain. Beyond it lies the open midship hold where the burial chamber stood, and where, before that, sea chests stood in their rows with men upon them, the loose pine decking, the cauldron's place, the shadow geography of a working ship, legible to anyone who has followed her story this far. And at the stern, on the starboard quarter, the rudder hangs on its withy exactly as it hung when a steersman last shipped the tiller, the oldest complete steering system of its kind in the world, waiting to all appearances for a hand. Around her in the neighbouring galleries rest her companions in the earth and in this second life. The swan-necked Oseberg ship with its coiling carved prow, the fragmentary tune ship, honest in its ruin, the small boats, the beds, the sledge, the tent heads with their remnant paint, the bronze cauldron, the gaming board, the whole furniture of the mound, dispersed now into cases and labels, but reassembling itself, for the visitor who knows, into a single autumn day around the year 900. Stand there long enough, and the museum's own sounds fall away, and what replaces them, in the mind's ear, is water. It is impossible, finally, to see her as anything but temporarily ashore. Every line of her argues motion. The stillness of the hall reads not as rest, but as held breath. And generations of visitors have reported the same involuntary thought in front of her, which is not how old she is, but how ready she looks. That readiness is the deepest of all the things the clay preserved. Age we can find anywhere. The world is full of ruins. But the Gokstad ship is not a ruin. She's a tool in working order whose crew stepped away 1,000 years ago. And the difference between those two things is the difference between an ending and a pause. Perhaps that is why the men and women who care for her speak of her without embarrassment in the language of the living. She is resting. She is moving house. She is fragile now. She must be kept. Perhaps it is why the nation that owns her has twice built its finest architecture around her sleep, and why the newest hall, rising in these very years, has been engineered like the setting for a crown. And perhaps it is why her story, told slowly in the dark, settles the mind the way it does. Because at the bottom of it, beneath the kings and the bones and the archaeology, it is a story about care. Care in the choosing of trees, care in the hewing of planks, care in the lashing of frames. The care of a household dressing a dead lord's ship with shields. The care of a clay that held everything without asking. The care of the boys' spades stopping in time, of Nicolasen's sideways trench, of conservators counting millimeters a century later. Almost nothing in this story was violent except the single hour that ended a man's life, and even that his people answered not with vengeance recorded, but with ceremony, with the most careful thing they knew how to do. 1100 years of history threaded through one hull, and the thread, at every turn, is the same. Someone in every generation that mattered took pains. The sea is patient, the clay is patient, and the ship survived because, again and again, people were patient too. Before the story closes, then, let us spend one imagined day aboard her, framed honestly as reconstruction, built only of period-true detail, but allowed, for these few minutes, to breathe. Because after all the archaeology, she deserves to be remembered doing the thing she was for. Say it is late summer, somewhere in the 1890s of the 9th century, as it were, in the years of her working prime. She lies at dawn in a nameless anchorage on the western shore of the great fjord, bow to the beach, a mooring line ashore around a boulder. The water so still that her shield's reflection lies unbroken along it. Smoke rises thin from the embers of last night's fire above the tide line. The awnings come down. The tent frames with their painted beast heads are folded and passed aboard. Men wade out with the last of the water casks on their shoulders. There is very little talking. Everyone has done this hundreds of times. The tide lifts her. Poles push her head around. The oars go out through their ports in a ripple of small wooden sounds. And at a single quiet word, she gathers way, out past the sleeping skerries. The only noise in the world, the creak of looms in oak and the drip of blades between strokes. An hour of rowing takes her clear of the headland into the open fjord, where the morning wind finds her, a fair wind off the land. And now comes the transformation her builders designed into her bones. Oars in and stowed on their crutches, the yards swayed up the mast, hand over hand. The great wool sail unfolding down the morning, like a held breath released, filling, setting, and the ship heeling gently to it and beginning, unmistakably, to run. The oarsmen become passengers. The steersman leans on the tiller, and she answers him through the withy with the small live tremor. Sailors of her replicas describe like men describing a pulse. The water starts to speak down her strakes, that particular hurrying whisper of a clinker hull at speed, each overlap adding its own thread of sound. And the wake draws out astern, and the shore begins to slide. 10 knots does not sound like much to a modern ear until it is 10 knots at the height of a man's chest above the water, in an open boat, with the whole hull flexing softly underfoot, like something breathing. Then it is enough speed for anyone. The day passes in the ancient rhythm of coastal sailing. The sun climbs. The men eat cold meat and hard bread and cheese where they sit. Someone sleeps in the shade of the sail with his head on a sea chest. Someone fishes. Someone works a splice. The steersman and the man forward call the marks to each other in half words. The bald island, the 3 trees, the white rock where the seals lie. The whole coast a memorized sentence being read at speed. Other sails show far off and are studied and named. This one a neighbour's, that one a stranger given sea room. Toward evening the wind falls light, as summer winds over these waters do, and the last hour is rowed again, unhurried, into a bay chosen before most of the crew were born as a good bay, where the ship takes the sand with a long, soft sound like a sigh, and the day ends as it began. Lines ashore, fire lit, cauldrons slung, the low talk of tired men under the first stars, and the ship standing black and patient at the water's edge, shields catching the firelight until the last man sleeps. Nothing in that day is invented beyond its arrangement. Every element is drawn from her own timbers, her own equipment, and the tested experience of the crews who have sailed her daughters. And a life was made of thousands of such days, hers and her people's. Days of which not one was recorded, because they were not the kind of thing anyone recorded. They were merely the kind of thing everything else rested on. When the sagas and the chronicles speak, they speak of the exceptional days, the battles, the burnings, the crownings. The ship in the museum speaks for all the other days, the uncounted ordinary ones. And that is one more reason the sight of her moves people who could not say why. She is the surviving witness of the unrecorded, the great routine of a vanished world, preserved in the one form routine ever takes when it wants to last, which is craft. Hold that day in mind now, and set beside it the other kind of day that filled her millennium, a day of the long burial. Choose one at random. Say, a spring morning some 400 years after the mound was closed, in the reign of some king of the new dispensation. Above her, in the light, the world has utterly changed. The farm speaks a Christianity now generations deep. A stave church stands within walking distance where the old rites are not even a memory, merely an absence, the very language shifting slowly in the mouths of the children playing. That morning, on the green hill in the field, as children always played there. Below them, in the dark, nothing whatever has happened. The blue clay holds its temperature and its silence. The shields lean where they lean. The cauldron sits by the mast stump. A few feet down, close enough that the children's running is a faint drum through the ground, the 9th century continues, complete and motionless at its own pace, which is no pace at all. Multiply that morning by 365, and that year by 1,000, and you have the true central fact of this whole story. The fact the mind can circle but never quite land on. The sheer oceanic quantity of quiet that the ship traversed between her two lives. Empires of the kind her people raided rose entire and fell entire. The forests that built her were felled, regrown, and felled again. Plague crossed the land above her twice over. Wars washed by. The farm changed hands and names and languages of prayer. And through all of it, she lay at her moorings in the clay, accumulating the one cargo she was never designed for, and now carries better than any ship afloat, time itself. Pure and undisturbed, 1,100 years of it, taken aboard a single night's sail from where she was launched. She is not, of course, the only ship to have made such a passage through time. And one of the gentlest ways to take her measure is to set her, at the end, in the company of her peers. The small, strange fellowship of great ships that outlived their worlds. It is a fellowship with very few members, because ships are among the most mortal of all human works. They live hard, they are worked to death or lost, and their material is the most perishable of the great building materials. Of all the hundreds of thousands of vessels launched before the modern era, the ones that survive substantially whole can very nearly be counted on 2 hands, and each survives by its own miracle. The oldest of them all lay beside the Great Pyramid at Giza, the funeral ship of the pharaoh Khufu, more than 4,000 years old, found dismantled into over 1,000 pieces in a sealed pit of stone. The cedar so perfectly preserved in the dry Egyptian dark that the modern restorers could reassemble her like the kit her builders had, in effect, left behind. A river barge of the Bronze Age, graceful and enormous, preserved by absolute dryness, as Gokstad was preserved by absolute wet. 2,000 years nearer to us, in a flooded lakebed south of Rome, lay the 2 pleasure ships of the Emperor Caligula, palaces afloat, recovered in the 20th century by the extraordinary expedient of draining the lake, and lost again, burned in the war within a few years of their rescue, the fellowship's great cautionary tale. Survival is never final. and every old ship lives on sufferance. From the Baltic, 4 centuries younger, comes the mightiest of the company, the Vasa, the great Swedish warship that capsized and sank on her maiden voyage within sight of Stockholm, and lay in the harbour's cold, wormless, brackish water for 3 1/3 centuries until she was raised, whole in the middle of the 20th century. A complete 17th century man of war, gun decks and carvings and all, preserved by cold and brine as Gokstad was preserved by clay. From the English Channel, the Mary rose, half a hull of Tudor England lifted from the seabed with her longbows and her surgeon's chest. And from the 9th century, from a farmer's field in Vestfold, the Gokstad ship, by common consent, the finest surviving vessel of the entire 1,000 years between Rome's fall and the age of the galleons, and the only one of the fellowship that represents not a single lost afternoon like Vasa's, nor a royal tomb offering built for the next world like Khufu's, but a working ocean-going ship in the fullness of a living tradition. Set them in a row in the imagination: the cedar barge, the drowned palaces, the oak longship, the carrack, the man of war, and something moving emerges from the comparison. They have nothing in common, not their waters, not their purposes, not their builders' gods, nothing except this, that each was, in its own world, the summit of what that world could do with wood and water, and that each was kept for us by an accident of chemistry, dryness, coldness, clay, mud, that no one planned and no one deserved. The fellowship of the surviving ships is a fellowship of luck. For every member, 1,000 equals rotted, burned, or broke up on unrecorded shores. The Long Serpent is gone, the treasure fleets are gone, every ship Columbus ever touched is gone. And the historian's sober conclusion is that we do not possess the greatest ships of the past. We possess the luckiest, and we must read the greatness through them. It is a humbling arithmetic, and it puts a particular weight on each survivor, the weight the Gokstad ship has carried since 1880. Each of these holes must stand in for its entire vanished kind, one specimen answering for a species. She has borne that weight better than any of them, perhaps, because of the manner of her keeping. Vasa was a disaster preserved. Her fascination is the fascination of the frozen accident. Khufu's ship was never meant for water at all, some scholars argue, or for one symbolic voyage only. But Gokstad was a true ship, used and worn, that was then deliberately, lovingly committed to the earth by people who meant her to matter forever. And she is therefore the only member of the fellowship whose survival fulfills an intention. The men and women who mounded her over were wrong about almost everything they expected. Wrong about the gods who would receive their king, wrong about the permanence of their order, wrong about the sanctity of the grave, which their own grandchildren's generation may have violated. But in the one great essential, they were entirely, spectacularly right. They believed that what they were burying was worth 1,000 years of keeping, and it was, and it has been kept. Across 11 centuries, the intention and the outcome join hands. There are very few places in all of archaeology where the dead succeed so completely, and that, in the end, may be the real source of the peace that people report in front of her hull. She is not only a survival, she is a promise that was kept, by the clay, by the accident, by the long chain of careful hands. A message sent by people who could not imagine us, delivered intact to people who can barely imagine them, and legible, after everything, in a single glance down the sweep of her rail. And so the threads of this long night can begin, gently, to be gathered. We have followed a single ship through 3 lives: the life of water, the life of earth, the life of light. And along the way, her story has kept opening onto a larger one, the one hinted at in every shipyard and every mound we have visited. the long human contest with the sea, conducted in wood across thousands of years, by a line of builders who never met and yet worked, in the deepest sense, together. Stand at the end of the story and look back down that line. At its far, dim beginning are the nameless people of the Northern Bronze Age, scratching pictures of impossible, many-paddled boats onto the rocks of Scandinavia, boats we know only as art. Then the builders of Hjortspring, sewing their war canoe of lime planks with cord, feeling their way toward the overlapped strake. Then the Nydam builders, who first drove iron rivets through the overlaps and made the clinker hull true. Then the forgotten geniuses of the 7th and 8th centuries who solved the mast and gave the tradition wings. Then the master of Oseberg, whose ship was a jewel, and the master of Gokstad, whose ship was an answer. The tradition's confident, weatherly, perfected reply to everything the ocean had been asking it for 1,000 years. Then onward, past the burial that removed her from the line without ending it. The builders of the Skuldelev fleet, stretching the language into warships and traders. The medieval builders who carried the clinker way into the age of cogs and then yielded the deep sea to other methods. The fjord builders who kept the small flame alive, boat by working boat, through 5 quiet centuries. And at last, the modern inheritors, the shipwrights of the replicas, standing in sawdust with axes deliberately relearned, and the conservators in white gloves, who build nothing and keep everything, and who are, in their way, the line's final and strangest flowering. Builders whose whole craft is to make one ship last forever. Every one of them, from the rock carvers to the laboratory, worked on the same problem. The problem does not change. Water is heavy, wind is strong, wood is willing but mortal, and human beings want to be on the other side of the horizon. Everything else, the dragon heads and the gun decks and the carbon fiber sails of our own day, is commentary. What the Gokstad ship holds, better than any object on Earth, is one moment of that everlasting problem solved with complete grace. A solution so clean that specialists a millennium later, armed with tank tests and computers, examine her lines and find, essentially, nothing to correct. There is a particular emotion that belongs to encounters like that, and it is not exactly awe, though awe is in it. It is something closer to recognition. The visitor who stands before her hull and feels the mind go quiet is recognizing, across 1,100 years, the presence of another mind. The unnamed master who walked the foreshore in Vestfold, looking, judging, trimming a line here by the width of a shaving, and recognizing that the distance between that mind and ours, which the word ancient makes feel like an abyss, is in truth no distance at all. He would understand a modern boatyard within an hour. He would understand the conservator's anxiety instantly and approve of it. And the questions he could answer, the name of the ship, the name of the king, the color of the sail going away down the fjord, are exactly the small human questions we cannot. While the questions we can answer, the year his trees stopped growing, the chemistry of his tar, the code written in his patron's bones, are ones he never thought to ask. Between his knowledge and ours, the ship sits precisely in the middle, facing both ways, keeping each side's secrets from the other, which is perhaps the truest description of what a great artifact is. Not a message from the past, but a table at which the past and the present sit down together, each bringing what the other lacks. That, in the end, is why her story soothes rather than saddens, though it is a story full of endings: a killed king, a robbed grave, a converted people, a vanished world. Because at the table she sets, nothing is finally lost. The forests that built her are gone, but their grain survives in her strakes, readable ring by ring. The women who spun her sail are unrecorded, but the thread is in the museum's cases, and their craft has been relearned thread by thread at modern looms. The rite that buried her is extinct, but its intention, keep this mattered, has been honored beyond the celebrant's wildest hope, and is honored again every morning the museum opens its doors. Even the man himself, nameless, robbed, 3 times buried, has arrived in the future after all. His stature and his strength and his last, hard hour known to millions, which is a stranger and perhaps a larger immortality than the one his mourners planned. The mound was meant to defeat time, and it failed, as everything fails. Time got in the end, wearing spectacles and carrying a trowel. But what time found when it got in, it loved. And that outcome, which no one in the 9th century could have designed, may be better than the one they wanted. They asked the earth for permanence. The earth, after 1,000 years of considering the request, gave back something finer: renewal. Here, then, is where everything in this story rests tonight. The ship herself stands in the museum on the Bygdøy Peninsula, across the water from Oslo, in the care of the university's Museum of Cultural History. Her hull complete, but for the lost crowns of her stem and stern, her timbers monitored season by season, her future being built around her in the form of the new halls designed to carry her through the centuries ahead. Beside her, in their own galleries, rest the Oseberg and Tune ships and the furniture of all 3 graves. The small boats, the beds, the sledge, the cauldron, the tent heads, the gaming board with its pieces of horn. The man from the mound rests among the national collections, his bones having taught, in this century, most of what we know about him, and holding in reserve, no doubt, whatever the instruments of the next century will think to ask. The replica Viking rests ashore in America, an ocean away from her mother, tended by volunteers. The mound at Gokstad stands restored in its field near Sandefjord, green over the emptied clay, with the traces of the old trading shore sleeping in the ground around it, only partly red. The archaeologists will be back, in their careful seasons, and the field has more to say. And somewhere beneath all of it, everywhere in the story's landscape, runs the sea itself, down the fjord past Bora and Oseberg, and the site of Kaupang, out past the skerries where her steersman once read the marks, and away to the wide grey horizons she was built to cross. The one element of this entire story that is exactly, in every particular, as it was: the same water, the same winds, the same long light of the northern summer evenings falling on it, indifferent and inexhaustible, still keeping its half of the ancient bargain and still waiting, as it has always waited, for whatever the people of the shore will build next. And if you would like a single image to carry with you down into sleep, let it be this one. Not the museum, and not the battle, and not even the funeral, but a quieter moment we can place, with fair confidence, somewhere near the story's beginning. It is an evening in Vestfold, around 1140 years ago. The ship is new, launched that season, fitted out, tried, and proven. And she is coming home up the fjord at the end of her first real voyage, running before a mild following wind in the long amber light that will not quite become darkness at that latitude, at that time of year. Her sail is full and quiet. Her wake draws a fading line back towards the open sea. On the headlands, people pause at their evening work to watch her pass, because she is worth watching, and they know who she is. And at the steering oar, a man leans easy on the tiller, feeling the hull breathe under him, bringing her in. Ahead, the home bay is already in shadow, the beach waiting, a fire lit somewhere above the tide line, and the ship runs on gently toward it through the bronze water. Young, perfect, at the very beginning of everything this long night has told, with the whole of her strange and patient story still ahead of her, and no one aboard, in the deep peace of that summer evening, suspecting a word of it. Let her sail there a while in that light, as long as you like. She has earned the evening, and so have you. And when sleep comes, let it come the way the tide came under her keel on the day she was launched, gradually and gently, and bearing you up without effort until you are afloat without ever noticing the moment it happened. Stories like this one, the slow chronicles of the great ships told softly through the dark, sail from this channel regularly, and if they bring you rest, you are warmly welcome to subscribe, so that the next one can find you when you need it. And if tonight's voyage carried you only part way before sleep arrived, then it did its work, and the rest of the story will be here, unchanged and unhurried, whenever you return. For now, there is nothing more that needs doing, and nothing more that needs knowing. The ship rides at her mooring in the quiet hall. The mound stands green in the summer field. The fjord lies still under the late light, keeping every secret it has kept for 1,000 years, and keeping them well. Good night and calm waters, and may your rest tonight be as deep and as long and as gently kept as hers.